Oberyn Martell had always been a man moved by passions both fiery and profound. In the dusty courtyards of Sunspear, he had been schooled in the arts of intrigue, swordplay, and seduction, all of which he perfected with the skill of an acrobat dancing along a razor's edge. When word first reached him of Daenerys Targaryen's rise in the distant east, her dragons unfurling leathery wings over the plains of Essos, her thirst to reclaim a throne thought lost, his interest smoldered like an ember tossed into a pile of tinder. Where others saw only rumor and distant prophecy, Oberyn saw an opportunity. He had always been the viper, the cunning snake poised to strike. The promise of a young Targaryen queen who might topple the Lannisters, those butchers of his sister and her children, glimmered in his mind, refusing to be extinguished by the demands of caution or the warnings of those around him. In the original course of events, Oberyn's impatience and thirst for vengeance against Gregor Clegane led him down a path that ended in brutal tragedy. The duel in King's Landing, the poisoned spear, his fatal slip into hubris. It was the stuff of legends or nightmares. Yet in this alternate path, a twist of fate or a moment of rare restraint led the Prince of Dorne to reconsider. Seeing that King's Landing was a nest of vipers bigger than himself, Oberyn decided he would neither fully trust Tywin Lannister's promises nor linger in a court where every whisper could be a betrayal. He feigned sickness on the day of Tyrion Lannister's trial by combat, claiming pains from an old wound. The Red Viper did not fight the mountain nor die that day. The trial went on without him, and events in King's Landing unfolded differently, but none of that mattered to Oberyn. He wanted no small measures of vengeance. He wanted the downfall of the entire Lannister line, and for that, he needed to ally with a true force of retribution. Returning to Dorne under the pretext of poor health, he wasted little time in gathering his most trusted allies, his paramour Ellaria Sand, some of his older daughters among the Sand Snakes, and even a few loyal swords from House Ironwood and House Dane. Though the Prince of Dorne, Doran Martell, was notoriously deliberate and slow to anger, Oberyn played on his elder brother's sense of duty to House Martell's legacy. No illusions or half-measures would suffice. Dorne could either wait for the Vipers in King's Landing to strike again or move first. It helped that the rumors of Daenerys Targaryen's liberations in Slaver's Bay had grown far more substantial. She had sacked Astapor, then moved on Yunkai, and now she held Meereen. She was not a powerless pretender. She had armies, dragons, and a cause that echoed of the justice Oberyn long desired. In hushed nighttime conferences, Oberyn pressed his argument to Doran. Supporting Daenerys Targaryen openly in Westeros was still fraught with danger. The Lannisters held the Iron Throne, the Tyrells supported them, and the North was embroiled in its own warfare. But if the Martells funneled their gold and resources more discreetly, they could help Daenerys gain enough strength to mount an invasion that could topple the Lannisters in one stroke. Doran listened carefully, rubbed his gout-ridden hands, and closed his eyes, as though trying to see the shape of the future. He asked Oberyn many times whether he believed in this silver-haired queen, whether she was truly a Targaryen with fire in her blood or simply a child playing at war. Oberyn answered with that same wild grin that had made him a legend on and off the battlefield. "She has dragons, brother, and they say she is ruthless to her enemies and merciful to the small folk. If that's not a Targaryen, I don't know what is." Doran acquiesced with caution. He would not openly commit all of Dorne's banners to a foreign war, for that would risk drawing the wrath of the Seven Kingdoms before Daenerys could hope to cross the narrow sea. Instead, he would supply Oberyn with enough gold and manpower to make the difference in Essos without leaving Sunspear vulnerable. As part of this arrangement, Oberyn was entrusted with forging a covert alliance with Daenerys. Once the Martells had her trust, Doran believed, she might be convinced that landing in Dorne with her forces was the surest way to strike at King's Landing. Oberyn embraced the plan with fervor, eager to see for himself this woman who some called the Breaker of Chains. He had a vision of a red sunrise over the desert scapes of Dorne, Daenerys Targaryen's banners unfurling alongside the golden sun and spear of House Martell. His vengeance at last might be realized. Travel to Essos was not difficult, for Oberyn had roamed those lands in his youth and had no fear of crossing the sea. He gathered an entourage that did not draw too much attention. A handful of sand snakes, each disguised as a bodyguard or handmaiden, and a small retinue of sellswords once loyal to Oberyn from older campaigns. They sailed from Planky Town, hugging the coast until they reached Lys, then hopping from Volantis to the Gulf of Grief, finally heading northward up the coast to Meereen. Along the way, Oberyn gleaned news of Daenerys' rule. She had toppled the slavers, installed herself as queen, but struggled to maintain order among the freedmen and the masters, who resented their new conditions. She also had her dragons, but they were young and unpredictable, not yet the unstoppable weapons of old Valyria. Oberyn recognized that his funds and cunning might be the key to stabilize Daenerys' hold on Meereen, and buy her an army large enough to cross the sea. When Oberyn arrived at the gates of Meereen, the city still bore the scars of revolution. The enormous bronze harpy that once crowned the Great Pyramid had been hauled down and smashed. Freedmen roamed in new pride, though they looked malnourished. Some wore tokens of loyalty to Daenerys, a small three-headed dragon badge or a scrap of cloth dyed Targaryen black and red. Others, however, cast suspicious glances at any foreigners who arrived with armed retinues. Word of the Sons of the Harpy, masked rebels who worked to undermine Daenerys' rule, drifted through the dusty alleys like a contagious fear. Amid these tensions, Oberyn could not help but feel a thrill course through him. This was a city on the cusp of something extraordinary. Amid chaos, an ambitious soul might bend events to his will. He sent word to Queen Daenerys that a Dornish prince sought an audience. Doubtless, she remembered House Martell from her family's old histories. Elia Martell, Rhaegar's wife, the tragedy that had befallen them in the sack of King's Landing. Daenerys had grown up hearing about the destruction of her house. She would not forget the name Martell. Oberyn knew that, at least, would grant him a foot in the door. Soon enough, an escort of Unsullied, tall spears held in disciplined lines, arrived to bring him and his small retinue inside the Great Pyramid. The Unsullied impressed him. Their discipline reminded him of the best of Dorne's armies, though there was something colder in their eyes. These were soldiers molded by cruelty, now loyal to a queen who had freed them. It occurred to Oberyn that forging a bond with Daenerys Targaryen might involve forging a bond with these men, whose devotion was total. At last, he ascended the steps of the Great Pyramid. The interior corridors shimmered with newly hung tapestries. Though once this place had likely been a testament to slave-holding masters, now it had become a seat of royal authority for a new breed of ruler. In a throne room repurposed from a former master's pleasure hall, Daenerys awaited. She sat on a modest, albeit elevated, seat of polished stone, flanked by two of her dragons, Drogon, the largest and regal, coiled near a statue's base. Her retinue was small but formidable. Ser Barristan Selmy stood guard beside her, the white-haired knight exuding a noble aura. Grey Worm and Missandei were near, each conferring with freedmen's representatives or delivering messages. The air smelled of incense that tried, and only partly succeeded, to mask the stench of the city's unwashed masses wafting from below. Oberyn made his bow with a theatrical flourish, sliding one foot forward and bending low as he placed a hand to his chest. He was used to the pomp and show of courts, but he wanted to offer Daenerys a kind of gallantry that was perhaps rare in these eastern lands. He introduced himself in the common tongue, though he suspected she understood the bastard Valyrian dialect of Essos perfectly well. "Your Grace, I am Oberyn Nymeros Martell, Prince of Dorne. I come bearing gifts and a proposition." Daenerys studied him with unblinking violet eyes. She was younger than Oberyn had expected, though there was a hardness to her gaze that spoke of struggles he couldn't yet fathom. When she spoke, her voice was measured and laced with curiosity. "Prince Oberyn, I am pleased to finally welcome one of my late sister-in-law's kin to Meereen. House Martell did not come to my aid when I was a child, cast adrift in the free cities. Why come now?" Her question was pointed but fair. Oberyn gave a wry smile, rising from his bow. "Because the time is right. Dorne has long held a grudge against the Lannisters for the murder of Elia Martell, your brother Rhaegar's wife, and her children. You, by your birth, are a symbol that a reckoning may yet come. The Lannisters sit on the Iron Throne, but we believe that throne was built with the blood of our kin and yours. The sands of Dorne have not forgotten." Daenerys did not answer immediately. She cast a glance at Ser Barristan, whose expression revealed no betrayal of his thoughts, but who likely remembered every detail of how the Targaryens were betrayed. Then she inclined her head. "That is a reason I can understand. But what is it you propose?" Oberyn stepped forward, ignoring the low growl that rumbled from Drogon's throat. "I propose an alliance. Dorne cannot openly break from the Seven Kingdoms. It would invite retribution before you even set foot on Westerosi soil. But I can funnel gold, supply ships, and eventually open a safe landing in Dorne once your armies are prepared. With your dragons, you're unsullied, and the men I can muster, you could sail for Westeros far sooner than you might otherwise manage. And the moment your banners appear on our shores, House Martell will declare for you, calling our banners and revealing the deception. The Lannisters will face a two-pronged attack, your invasion from the coast, and our uprising from within the kingdom." A hush descended. Even the scrape of scales from Daenerys' dragons seemed to pause in that moment of contemplation. Daenerys leaned forward, eyes fixed on Oberyn's face. "I've had men claim they would support me before," she said quietly. "Some even offered gold. But a Targaryen alone in the world is a terrible thing. I've learned caution. Why should I trust you more than any other lord who seeks advantage from my cause?" Oberyn answered without missing a beat. "Because Dorne loved your brother Rhaegar, and we still mourn my sister Elia. The Lannisters are our mortal enemies. Any advantage we seek is solely in making sure we see them destroyed. We may gain from supporting you, yes, but our gains are your gains. Restitution for House Targaryen. We have never forgotten that you are the rightful heirs to the Iron Throne." In that exchange of words, a glimmer of mutual understanding formed. Both Daenerys and Oberyn needed each other, and both had enemies that aligned perfectly. Daenerys, in truth, was struggling in Meereen. She was far from home, trying to quell unrest in a city whose very bones were built on slavery. Though she had freed the people, she found that her rule was precarious. She lacked gold to pay for more sellswords, lacked ships to transport her armies, and lacked the subtle intelligence networks to outmaneuver the resurgent slaver forces at Yunkai and beyond. Oberyn's promise addressed each concern. He would fund the expansion of her fleet, hire the necessary sellswords to keep Meereen secure, and quietly open lines of trade that would bring needed supplies. In the shadows of the Great Pyramid, the seeds of a potent alliance took root. The arrangement was not sealed in a single conversation. Over the course of many days, Oberyn walked the halls of Meereen with Daenerys, discussing the city's problems, the freedmen's councils, the brazen attacks by the Sons of the Harpy. He offered cunning solutions: coin to pay local sellswords loyal only to the Queen, bribes to certain influential former masters who might be turned with the right promise, and a special network of Dornish spies to sniff out hidden traitors. Oberyn also had a keen sense of justice. While he would stoop to bribery or manipulation, he did not counsel Daenerys to become a tyrant. On the contrary, he admired her moral stance, though he sometimes teased her that a queen must know when to bare her fangs. He recounted the story of Nymeria, the warrior queen of the Rhoynar, who burned her ships so that her people would have no choice but to conquer Dorne. Sometimes, to unite your followers, you must make a statement so bold it sears into their memory forever, he told Daenerys over a private dinner of spiced goat and honeyed wine. It doesn't always involve mercy. Daenerys listened. In Oberyn, she found a voice that balanced Ser Barristan's chivalrous counsel and Dario Naharis's reckless bravado. And if she harbored any suspicion that Oberyn might betray her, she found reassurance in the starkness of his vow. If she failed, or if she turned on him, the Lannisters would remain unbroken in Westeros, and Dorne's vengeance would slip from his grasp. Their alliance, in a twisted way, was forged by the same hunger for justice, the same thirst for a dawn untainted by Lannister gold. And so, in a solemn ceremony in the throne room of the Great Pyramid, Daenerys accepted the alliance with Oberyn Martell. They did not declare it to the world, of course. Officially, Oberyn was just a Dornish traveler offering tribute to the Queen of Meereen. But behind the scenes, gold flowed from hidden coffers, and a subtle shift in Daenerys' power base began. Within weeks, Rumors spread throughout Meereen of newly arrived ships anchored in the harbor. Sleek merchant vessels from Dorne, brimming with supplies. Sails dyed in neutral colors disguised their origins, but the men who came ashore bore the sinewy grace of Dornish warriors. They brought hammered chests of gold, shipments of wine, dried fruits, and grains to feed the freedmen. More importantly, Oberyn used this gold to bolster the local economy, paying freedmen to repair roads, fortify walls, and re-establish trade routes. Daenerys, once forced to rely on the uncertain taxes of a city in upheaval, now found she had resources to create a semblance of stability. People began to see tangible improvements. Even the sons of the Harpy grew wary. Their masked attacks met with heightened patrols of unsullied and newly employed mercenaries whose loyalty was assured, if only because Oberyn's coin lined their purses. This injection of wealth did not solve every problem, of course. Discontent festered among the former slavers, some of whom had fled to Yunkai or farther east, plotting revenge. Tension between Daenerys's freedmen and the old families still caused frequent riots. The city's bylaws, hastily adapted from a culture built on chains, were chaotic at best. But Oberyn gave Daenerys breathing room, a chance to steady her throne rather than constantly scramble to smother revolt. And for Oberyn, each day in Meereen was a lesson in Daenerys's character. He saw her smile at freedmen children who brought her flowers, saw her frown when dealing with the petty demands of old aristocrats, and saw her steel herself when she had to order the execution of a slaver who murdered innocents. She was not perfect. He thought at times she was too merciful, too quick to let her emotions guide her judgments. But she had something that stoked the embers in his heart. Righteous fury, balanced by compassion. She reminded him, in some distant way, of what a true queen should be. Unsurprisingly, Oberyn's presence also caused friction among Daenerys's inner circle. Daario Naharis, the brash Sellsword, chafed at the smooth-talking Dornish prince who could match him in both wit and, if stories were true, combat skill. Daario was used to flirting with Daenerys, playing the role of the brazen suitor. Oberyn, though respectful of Daenerys's position, carried himself with a swagger that undercut Daario's uniqueness. Occasionally, the tension would flare in snide remarks or subtle challenges. Oberyn, for his part, found Daario's flamboyance amusing. He teased the Tyroshi mercenary about his dyed beard and golden tooth. Yet beneath the banter lay a real rivalry, each man determined to prove his worth. Ser Barristan, on the other hand, was relieved by the alliance, though he maintained a guarded stance. He had known Prince Doran to be a cautious man and Oberyn to be a restless spirit. He feared that Oberyn might push Daenerys into rash decisions. But he was not blind to the benefits of Oberyn's gold and cunning. The old knight confided in Oberyn one evening, "I served your brother-by-law, Rhaegar. I saw how he carried the hopes of the realm, and how quickly those hopes can burn if one missteps. Be mindful of Daenerys's burdens. She carries more than just her own dreams." Oberyn, touched by Barristan's memories of Elia and Rhaegar, pledged that his loyalty was genuine and that he would not lead Daenerys into ruin. Meanwhile, Grey Worm showed little outward emotion about the alliance. The commander of the Unsullied followed Daenerys's orders and remained stoic. Yet Oberyn sensed that Grey Worm approved, if only because the resources meant his brothers-in-arms would not be stretched so thin, forced to quell rebellions without respite. Missandei, Daenerys's sharp-witted translator and aide, proved a valuable ally in bridging cultural gaps. Though she was young, her keen understanding of Essos's languages and customs helped Oberyn navigate the city's labyrinthine politics. Over cups of sweet wine, the two often discussed how best to undermine the Sons of the Harpy without sparking open rebellion. The alliances in Meereen shifted in a more profound way one night when Daenerys called a private council with Oberyn, Ser Barristan, Grey Worm, and Missandei. They gathered in a sparsely furnished war room, its walls hung with tattered banners from Astapor and Yunkai. A large wooden table displayed a rough map of the surrounding regions. Daenerys, wearing a simple dress of midnight blue, gestured at the map. "We have news that Yunkai is rebuilding its forces, joining with new slaver sponsors from Volantis," she began. "They aim to retake Meereen or, at least, destabilize it enough that I leave. If I focus solely on Westeros now, I risk losing everything here. But if I linger too long, the opportunity to strike at the Lannisters might slip away. Oberyn studied the map. A conundrum indeed, Your Grace. The Lannisters are consolidating their power in King's Landing even now. Cersei Lannister rules in her son's name, and she is cunning enough to stave off threats. If you delay, she will strengthen her alliances. The Tyrells support the Lannisters, but that bond is not unbreakable. A timely invasion could shatter it. However, you can't well leave Meereen to anarchy. He traced a finger across the map to Yunkai. But if you leave half your forces behind in Meereen, your crossing might be too weak. Barristan cleared his throat. My queen, I would advise we settle Meereen's troubles quickly. If Yunkai marches on us, we must defeat them decisively. Show the other cities of Slavers Bay there is no hope in fighting you. Once that is done, perhaps we can leave a capable governor in Meereen, someone who upholds your values, and sail with the bulk of the army west. Grey Worm's face was impassive. Unsullied will follow you anywhere, Your Grace. We can hold Meereen if you wish, but the freedmen trust only you to keep them free. Daenerys frowned. Hence the problem. If I leave, will the freedmen remain safe? Will old injustices creep back? I swore I would break the wheel, not abandon them to the same cycle of oppression. Oberyn raised a hand gently. But if you stay too long, the Lannisters remain unchallenged, and they might grow too strong. We must strike a balance. You are Queen of Meereen, but you are also the last Targaryen heir. The Iron Throne cannot be left to the lions indefinitely. Daenerys turned to him, her eyes flashing with a determination that caused his own heart to quicken. You have been generous with your gold, Prince Oberyn. But do you have enough to fund a decisive victory against Yunkai? Perhaps a short campaign that will make them yield once and for all. Oberyn ran a hand through his dark hair. If you can muster an army to meet them in the field, my gold can hire every reputable sellsword company in these regions. Even the Second Sons might be able to double their numbers. I can also pay for siege engines, supplies, and bribes to ensure Yunkai's allies desert them. With enough cunning, you can crush them swiftly. Daenerys's lips curved in a smile that held a hint of predatory gleam. Then let us do it. We defeat Yunkai's forces, secure Meereen's safety, and make a statement to the entire region. Then, while I leave a trusted steward behind, someone the freedmen can look to in my absence, I will sail for Westeros. She placed a hand on the map, directly over the coastline near Sunspear. You said you can open the way in Dorne? Provide me with a safe landing. Oberyn nodded, leaning forward. The best place to land would be along the coast near Planky Town. It is well connected, but it won't raise immediate alarm from the Lannisters if they don't see your banners until you're already ashore. My brother will be ready. The moment your army sets foot on Dorne sands, we will declare for House Targaryen. Our lords will rally. The Tyrells might hesitate to march south to face us on our home terrain, giving you time to push north. The capital is not far by ship from Dorne, and if you coordinate a naval approach with the land forces, well, the Lannisters will be caught off guard. Daenerys's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of destiny. Then let us begin. We first break Yunkai. The campaign against Yunkai tested the alliance thoroughly. Oberyn's gold and Daenerys's ferocity combined to form an unstoppable wave of might. Sellsword companies who once wavered in loyalty found themselves well paid to join Daenerys' side. Meanwhile, her Unsullied remained the core of the army, disciplined and unflinching. Daenerys took to the battlefield atop Drogon's back, though the dragon was still young and not as vast as the fabled Balerion. Yet even a young dragon was enough to sow terror in the ranks of Yunkai's forces. Though the Yunkish had tried to hire their own mercenaries, they could not match the flow of Dornish gold fueling Daenerys' war chest. Months of battles and sieges culminated in a final assault outside the walls of Yunkai, where Daenerys unleashed Drogon's flames on their lines and shattered their resolve. Oberyn fought with a spear in hand, his presence stirring fear in the hearts of slavers who recognized him as an exotic and dangerous warrior. The freedmen who followed Daenerys cheered the Red Viper's prowess, chanting both her name and his in the thick of battle. Despite stiff resistance in the early stages, the city fell, and the old masters capitulated. Daenerys forced them to sign brutal treaties that outlawed slavery across their domains, then installed a local freedmen council to oversee the city in her name. Oberyn's spies and bribes ensured that Yunkai's most ambitious resistors were taken care of, either through imprisonment or exile. While some in Essos whispered that Daenerys was no better than the conquerors of old, many freedmen saw her as the breaker of chains, unchallenged now in Slaver's Bay. The cities of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen all owed allegiance to Daenerys Targaryen, and Oberyn Martell's funds made sure these allegiances were maintained through a mix of prosperity and fear. It was not a flawless peace, but it was enough to allow Daenerys to do what she had yearned for since she first uttered the word home. She could finally set her sights on Westeros. She would not abandon Slaver's Bay entirely. She named Dario Naharis the regent of Meereen, trusting that his Sellsword cunning, combined with the freedmen councils and a strong garrison of Unsullied, would keep the city from falling back into darkness. It was a risk, but Daenerys believed Dario would fight fiercely to protect her interests. She left small contingents of Unsullied and her newly reformed slave soldiers in Yunkai and Astapor, as well as setting up local freedmen councils to continue the governance she had established. The bulk of her force, 20,000 strong, a mix of Unsullied, freedmen volunteers, and mercenaries, would sail west under her banners. For Oberyn, this moment was like the final coil of a striking viper. He had laid the groundwork with his gold and cunning. Now it was time to see if the blow would prove mortal to House Lannister. Before the journey, he dispatched several swift ships to sail ahead and inform Doran Martell of the final plan. Doran would ensure the Dornish coast was ready to receive the Targaryen fleet in secrecy. The next step was to keep the entire operation hidden from the eyes of Varys's little birds, of Cersei's spies, of the Iron Fleet that might roam the waters. Oberyn and Daenerys sent out false rumors that she intended to press eastward into lands beyond the Red Waste, or that she had her eyes on Volantis. Anything to distract the eyes of Westeros from her real target. Ships carrying her banners sailed in smaller groups at first, disguised as merchant vessels or slaver ships, converging at a rendezvous point in the Summer Sea. There, Daenerys's full fleet formed, a ragtag armada of repurposed slaver galleys, newly constructed warships built with Oberyn's coin, and merchant cogs pressed into service. The crossing itself took several weeks of anxious sailing. Storms threatened more than once, and some ships lost their course. Yet fate, or the gods, favored them enough that they encountered no major blockade, no sudden assault by the fleets of Westeros. Perhaps the Lannisters and their allies simply did not imagine the Targaryen queen would come so soon. After all, word from Essos suggested Daenerys was still entangled in the politics of Meereen. Unbeknownst to them, Oberyn had changed everything. At last, land appeared on the horizon, the sun-scorched cliffs and rolling dunes of Dorne. In the dawn light, Daenerys stood on the prow of her flagship, her silver-gold hair whipped by the sea wind, her face alight with wonder and tension. Drogon soared overhead, black wings stretched wide, while Regal and Viserion followed in the distance. Oberyn joined her, his amber eyes scanning the familiar coastline. "Welcome to my home, your grace," he said softly. "Welcome to the Seven Kingdoms." They landed near Planky Town under the cover of darkness and secrecy. Dornish scouts loyal to House Martell had cleared the surrounding area of potential spies, and the local fisherfolk were instructed to remain indoors while these mysterious ships came ashore. The first wave of Unsullied disembarked, forming a disciplined perimeter. Then came the freedmen auxiliaries, mercenaries, and supply crates. Daenerys was among the earliest to step onto the beach, kneeling to run her fingers through the sand. A strange mix of emotions washed over her. She was home in Westeros, though not yet in the city where her ancestors had once ruled. The promise of her birthright lay beyond deserts and mountains, across the reach, near the mouth of the Blackwater. But each step on Westerosi soil felt like a reclamation of something that had been stolen from her. Oberyn helped coordinate with the local Dornish forces who materialized at dawn. Their banners displayed the sun and spear of House Martell. Their commander, Prince Trystane Martell, Doran's son, greeted Daenerys with all the ceremony that the secrecy of the moment would allow. He bowed, hand over heart, welcoming her to Dorne. Trystane explained that his father waited for them at Sunspear. The plan was to shelter Daenerys' army in the Dornish deserts and passes, away from prying eyes, while final preparations were made. The roads would be carefully guarded, messages tightly controlled. Oberyn wanted the first blow against the Lannisters to be sudden and decisive. They marched through the night, an eerie yet exhilarating exodus. Thousands of Daenerys' men followed dusty paths that wound through rocky outcroppings, the flickering light of torches revealing a land both harsh and beautiful. For those freedmen who had never seen Westeros, it was an alien realm. But Oberyn's words and the promise of sharing in a grand victory spurred them onward. Daenerys rode alongside Oberyn, cloaked in the swirling desert wind, occasionally glimpsing the black shape of a dragon soaring overhead. Finally, they reached Sunspear, the ancestral seat of House Martell. Rising from the dunes, Sunspear's slender towers and spike-crowned walls loomed like spears aimed at the sky. The next phase of the plan unfolded rapidly. Oberyn Martell formally greeted Daenerys within the walled keep, bowing with the utmost respect. The corners of his eyes betrayed the constant pain of gout, yet there was an unmistakable gleam of satisfaction on his face. Here was the Targaryen queen he had quietly supported in his daydreams, the living symbol of vengeance for his beloved sister. "House Martell is at your service," he said simply, and Daenerys recognized the gravity of that pledge. Dorne was famously independent-minded, even rebellious. For Oberyn to yield in spirit as well as in word meant a great deal. Oberyn watched Daenerys and Oberyn speak as Ilaria Sand and the Sand Snakes stood by, their expressions ranging from curiosity to fierce approval. Oberyn himself felt a surge of triumph, though he tempered it with caution. The real battles lay ahead. The alliance was secured, the queen was here, but the Lannisters still sat the Iron Throne. The Tyrells could muster a vast army, and the other kingdoms might not welcome a Targaryen restoration so readily. And yet, as Daenerys offered Oberyn her thanks and promised House Martell a future in which their grievances were redressed, Oberyn felt sure of one thing. The tide had shifted in Westeros. No longer was Daenerys an exile across the sea, quietly plotting her return. She was here in the flesh with soldiers and dragons, and it was Oberyn who had sped that destiny to fruition. For several weeks, the combined forces of Daenerys and Dorne made ready. They restocked supplies, scouted the roads into the Stormlands, and prepared the ships for a possible naval assault up the coast. Oberyn wrote letters in code to certain lords in the Reach who had once been sympathetic to the Targaryen cause, some with old grudges against the Tyrells or Lannisters. Oberyn and Daenerys strategized around a great war table in Sunspear's upper hall, marking the known dispositions of the Lannister forces. They learned that Tommen Baratheon sat the throne, guarded by his mother, Cersei. The Tyrell alliance remained intact, but there were frictions. Margaery Tyrell was queen to Tommen, though some whispered of tensions with Cersei. The Boltons held the north, though rumors spoke of insurgencies led by the surviving Starks. The Riverlands were ravaged by war, the Vale quiet under Petyr Baelish's cunning rule. In short, the realm was fractured and tired. A bold strike might topple the monarchy before the lords could truly unite. Daenerys, Oberyn, and Oberyn weighed their options carefully. One plan was to sail north along the coast, landing near King's Landing for a swift siege, using the dragons to take the city by storm. Another plan advocated a land approach through the Stormlands, rallying possible Baratheon loyalists who might hate the Lannisters. Oberyn personally favored a two-pronged approach. Let Daenerys and some of the Unsullied sail for the Blackwater, threatening the city directly, while Dornish and Targaryen forces advanced from the Boneway into the Stormlands, forcing the Lannisters to divide their attention. Daenerys worried about splitting her forces, but the advantage of surprise was tempting. In the end, they decided on a compromise. The fleet, under the banner of the Targaryen dragon, would make a show of force off the coast of King's Landing, drawing the royal navy out. Meanwhile, Oberyn, commanding a substantial force of Dornish troops and a contingent of Unsullied, would march northward by land, capturing key castles in the Stormlands that might defect to the Targaryen cause. Daenerys would ride with the main army, accompanied by her dragons, ready to pivot to whichever front needed her might. The day of departure from Sunspear was like an echo of ancient Targaryen conquests. People lined the streets, throwing flowers and cheering for Daenerys, who rode at the head of her formation on a sleek sand-colored mare. She wore a light set of armor hammered in the shape of dragon scales, her hair braided back in a warrior's style. Oberyn rode beside her, clad in shining copper-colored plate, his spear strapped across his back. Behind them marched the Unsullied, rows of proud freedman warriors, and Dornish spears bristling with the sun and spear sigils. Pennants fluttered in the wind, merging black and red with gold and orange. The sight inspired a fervor that Oberyn had rarely felt before, a sense that they were living at the cusp of a new age. They advanced through the scorching canyons and dusty passes of Dorne, heading toward the Bone Way. Word traveled ahead of them, carried by ravens and terrified merchants. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister received the news with alarm. Reports of dragons in Dorne had initially been met with disbelief, but confirmation soon arrived. She summoned her council, demanded every resource be turned to fortifying the capital and rallying the Reach. Margaery Tyrell, whispering with her father Mace, recognized that the time of decision had come. Yet the Tyrells did not rush blindly to the Lannisters' side. They weighed their odds. A Targaryen queen with dragons and Dornish support was formidable. Some Tyrell lords had always harbored resentments that the Lannisters overshadowed them. The cracks in the alliance began to widen. As Oberyn's forces spilled out of the Bone Way into the Stormlands, they encountered scattered pockets of resistance. Some Storm Lords pledged fealty to Tommen Baratheon and tried to fight. Others, hearing of dragons, decided to throw in their lot with Daenerys. The land had been ravaged by the War of the Five Kings, leaving many castles under-garrisoned. Oberyn, with a flourish of gold, offered those who surrendered a place in the new order, while those who resisted faced the Unsullied's unyielding assault. Daenerys rode at the head of her column, often sending Drogon into the skies to make an intimidating show. Castles that might have withstood a mundane siege thought twice when a black-winged beast was perched on their ramparts, spewing gouts of flame. Thus, the Stormlands, battered and tired, began to fall under the Targaryen banner. Meanwhile, the Targaryen fleet had sailed around the coast, capturing a few minor ports, skirmishing with the Royal Navy. Though not a grand force like the old Targaryen navies of yore, it was substantial enough to challenge the disorganized royal ships that had been left under the command of a Lannister admiral lacking experience. Word spread like wildfire. The Targaryen queen had come, with dragons and an army, and Dorne was fully in her camp. The realm stood on the brink of another war, but this time, the advantage seemed to lie with the returning exiles, not the throne. Cersei, desperate, turned to the Tyrells for immediate reinforcements. But Mace Tyrell dragged his feet, citing the need to gather his bannermen properly. In truth, he suspected that if the Targaryens were victorious, the Tyrells might negotiate favorable terms to maintain their power. If the Lannisters were losing, why tie themselves to a sinking ship? Cersei raged at the delays, sending curt demands and veiled threats. Tommen, too young to truly command, followed his mother's lead. The tension in King's Landing rose. The small folk heard that dragons soared in the skies to the south. Some cheered quietly at the possibility that the hated Lannisters might be overthrown. Others cowered in fear, remembering tales of the last time dragons roamed the world. The city's gates were reinforced, its walls manned by gold cloaks, and every able-bodied man pressed into service. King's Landing braced for a siege. Oberyn led the main host north through the Stormlands, capturing the last major stronghold near the border with the Crownlands. The first real test of their might against a substantial Lannister force occurred on a broad plain near the Wendwater. The Lannisters had mustered a host from the Crownlands lords still loyal to them, augmented by a few Tyrell bannermen pressured to fight. The two armies met in a swirl of dust and steel. Daenerys, astride Drogon, soared above the battlefield, unleashing draconic terror on the opposing cavalry. Oberyn commanded the Dornish foot soldiers, their spears glinting in the sun as they advanced in disciplined ranks. The Unsullied formed an impenetrable shield wall, breaking the first charge of enemy knights. The freedmen archers, though less disciplined, rained arrows from the flanks. In the thick of the melee, Oberyn spotted a knight bearing a lion's sigil on his surcoat. Memories of the mountain's monstrous figure flashed in his mind, fueling his desire for vengeance. He spurred his horse forward, spear in hand, weaving through combatants until he confronted the Lion Knight. The man was not Gregor Clegane, of course, but Oberyn fought him as if every Lannister knight bore the guilt of Elaya's murder. Their duel was short and brutal. Oberyn's spear struck the knight in the throat, ending his life before he could even utter a curse. With that kill, Oberyn felt a surge of savage satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that the real prize lay in King's Landing. Before long, the Lannister force broke, many surrendering rather than face the Queen's dragon overhead. Some fled back toward the capital. The field belonged to Daenerys. It was a decisive victory, one that opened the road to King's Landing with minimal resistance. Standing amidst the aftermath of corpses and wounded men, Daenerys ordered the immediate care of her own injured and offered fair treatment to prisoners who would swear not to take up arms against her again. The freedmen from Essos looked upon her with reverence. Oberyn saw in her gestures the foundation of a new kind of rule, one not built solely on fear but on the promise of mercy, provided one bowed to her rightful claim. He recalled telling her, once, that a queen must know when to show her fangs. But here she showed they could also be sheathed under certain circumstances, and it endeared her to the local populace who began to see her less as a foreign invader and more as a just, if formidable, ruler. The final march to King's Landing passed through fields scorched by the last vestiges of summer heat. Camps of refugees huddled along the roads, fleeing the war that had battered the realm for so many years. Daenerys's columns, though large, moved with surprising efficiency, thanks to Dornish guides who scouted ahead and ensured wells were not poisoned and bridges were intact. By the time the outskirts of King's Landing came into view, news had already arrived that a Targaryen force approached. Cersei had assembled every gold cloak, every hired sword, and every loyal knight behind the city walls. She locked down the gates, posted archers on the ramparts, and prayed that the wildfire caches stashed beneath the city would not become necessary to her defense. Daenerys and Oberyn surveyed King's Landing from a vantage point on the hills to the south. The city sprawled along the Blackwater, its walls formidable. Maegor's Holdfast and the Red Keep loomed, red stone catching the late afternoon sun. Daenerys closed her eyes briefly, imagining how her ancestors had taken this city. Dragons had been the key then, and they would be the key again. Oberyn watched her expression, seeing the mixture of longing, anger, and hope. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is it," he murmured. "Your throne awaits within those walls. Are you ready?" She opened her eyes, a fire burning in them. "Yes, Westeros has suffered enough under these usurpers and traitors. I will take what is mine, and I will make them answer for every injustice." The siege of King's Landing began in earnest. Daenerys' forces surrounded the city on the landward sides, while her fleet blockaded the mouth of the Blackwater. Cersei tried a few sallies, but each was repelled, the attackers forced back by the unsullied phalanxes and volleys of Dornish arrows. Daenerys, from atop Drogon, circled the city's skies, unleashing short bursts of flame on strategic points, the main gates, any siege engines the defenders erected. She did not want to burn the city to the ground. She intended to rule it, but she was not afraid to demonstrate the power of her dragons, who had grown larger and more fearsome over the months spent in Meereen and during the voyage. The effect on morale was devastating for the defenders. Gold cloaks who once boasted of holding the walls realized that no stone battlement could withstand dragon fire indefinitely. Inside the city, fear ran rampant. Rumors spoke of Daenerys as the Mad King's daughter, come to exact vengeance with demonic creatures. Others talked of her as a liberator who freed slaves across the sea, sparking secret hopes among the impoverished masses. Some whispered that the queen had already promised clemency if the gates were opened to her. Cersei responded by ordering the gold cloaks to put down any sign of disloyalty with brutal force. The tension rose day by day, culminating in riots and fierce clampdowns. By the second week of the siege, bread was scarce, water was rationed, and the stench of the city's panic was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Oberyn led sabotage efforts, using his network of Dornish spies and cunning freedmen to infiltrate the city through hidden sally ports and bribe certain guards. They distributed leaflets claiming Daenerys was not here to destroy King's Landing but to topple the Lannisters and restore just rule. A handful of gold cloaks deserted. Some lesser lords began to wonder if it was better to throw open the gates and be done with this. But Cersei still held Tommen, the boy king, and threatened that if any lord acted against her, they would be declared traitors, executed, or starved out. Daenerys, impatient to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, ordered a final parley. She flew Drogon to the city walls, accompanied by a few riders waving the Targaryen banner. Standing high above the main gate, Cersei appeared with Tommen by her side, flanked by the Kingsguard. Her face was drawn and pale, but her eyes were hard. Daenerys raised her voice so all on the walls might hear. "People of King's Landing, I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen. I come to reclaim the throne that was stolen from my family. Surrender and I will show mercy. Fight and I will unleash my dragons upon these walls. Do not let Cersei Lannister's pride cost you your lives." The echoes of her words carried far, accompanied by Drogon's terrible roar. Cersei spat defiance from the battlements, declaring Daenerys a usurper, a foreign invader who wanted to burn them all as the Mad King once threatened. But Daenerys' presence, the living, breathing Targaryen queen astride a monstrous black dragon, undercut Cersei's attempts to paint her as a powerless pretender. Fear spread among the onlookers, and murmurings followed. That night, more desertions occurred. By dawn, the gold cloaks manning the gate had come to an agreement. They would open the gates if Daenerys promised to spare them. Word reached Daenerys, who consulted with Oberyn and her commanders. If the gates opened, an assault force could rush in and swiftly capture strategic points, hopefully avoiding a long, bloody siege. Of course, it could be a trap, but Oberyn believed the gold cloaks were genuine. They were not eager to face dragons at close range. Just as the sun began to rise, the main gates swung open. Daenerys' vanguard, led by Grey Worm and Oberyn Martell, surged into the city. They encountered disorganized resistance from pockets of loyalist gold cloaks, but the infiltration quickly snowballed. The bulk of the city's defenders either laid down arms or melted away. Ordinary citizens cowered in alleyways, not daring to impede the invading force. Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, ensuring no portion of the city turned into a cunning ambush. At the Red Keep, a final standoff took shape. Cersei and the Kingsguard barricaded themselves in the throne room with Tommen. The halls of the Red Keep echoed with the sound of steel on steel as Dornish troops and Unsullied cut through the last lines of resistance. Oberyn found himself among the first to storm into the throne room, spear in hand, heart pounding with anticipation. He gazed upon the Iron Throne, that twisted mass of swords that had been drenched in the blood of his sister's children. Cersei stood at the foot of the throne, a dagger pressed to Tommen's side, a deranged glint in her eyes. The Kingsguard, battered and anxious, ringed her, uncertain whether to fight or surrender. Daenerys entered moments later with Ser Barristan. Drogon landed on a courtyard balcony, the rumble of his breath shaking the walls. Cersei's laughter was bitter. So this is how it ends, with a foreign queen and a damned Dornish serpent at her side. Oberyn's voice was soft, lethal. "I am the Viper, yes. You let your father and your brute kill my sister and her children. Now it is your turn to face justice." Cersei tightened her grip on Tommen, who trembled. "Justice?" she scoffed. "You think burning down the city is justice? You think handing the throne to a Targaryen is justice? You're all mad." Daenerys' expression was cold, though her voice held a hint of sympathy as she looked at Tommen. "Release the king, Cersei. He's just a boy. You don't have to end this with more bloodshed." Cersei's eyes flickered with desperation. She looked at the assembled warriors. Unsullied, Dornish spears, freedmen. Then she looked at Tommen, confusion and fear twisting her features. The facade of absolute defiance cracked. For a moment, Oberyn almost felt pity. But he remembered Elaya's screams, the false promises of Tywin Lannister, and every injustice the Lannisters had committed since. He did not waver. Reluctantly, Cersei released Tommen. The boy stumbled forward, tears streaming down his cheeks, and Ser Barristan took him gently by the arm, pulling him away from Cersei. The Kingsguard lowered their swords. In that moment, the reign of the Lannisters ended. Cersei collapsed to her knees, defiance replaced by hollow fury. "It won't last," she spat. "You'll tear yourselves apart. You'll be no better than the ones before you." Daenerys approached the throne, each footstep echoing in the vast chamber. She studied the Iron Throne, a relic of her ancestors' conquest. Her reflection in the twisted swords seemed to merge with the memories of her forebears. Oberyn stood behind her, his spear tip resting on the marble floor, waiting. At length, Daenerys turned and looked to the people in the throne room. Her own followers, the men who had surrendered, the boy king still trembling under Ser Barristan's protection. She ascended the steps and took her seat on the Iron Throne. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of torches. The Targaryen queen had reclaimed what generations of Lannisters and Baratheons had sought to keep from her. Tommen, disoriented, looked up at Daenerys, then back at his mother, who glared daggers. The boy seemed to realize he was no longer king. Missandei, stepping forward, spoke in a clear voice. "All hail Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, first of her name, Queen of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Protector of the Realm, the Breaker of Chains, and Mother of Dragons." Oberyn watched the scene with a strange sense of completion. He saw Ser Barristan kneel, Grey Worm kneel, and many others follow suit. Even some of the gold cloaks sank to their knees. Oberyn, as proud as he was, bent the knee as well, acknowledging the alliance that had borne fruit. His heart thundered. House Martell's vengeance was all but realized. The Lannister queen was deposed. The wheel had turned, and the Targaryen dragon perched atop it once more. Daenerys motioned for everyone to rise. Her gaze fell upon Cersei, who knelt on the floor, eyes burning with hatred, her golden hair tangled across her shoulders. A hush fell over the throne room as people awaited the queen's judgment. Would Daenerys be merciful or cruel? Vengeance demanded a heavy hand, but mercy might prove the strength of a true ruler. At last, Daenerys spoke, her voice carrying a regal authority. "Cersei of House Lannister, you are stripped of all titles and claims. For your crimes against the realm, I could sentence you to death. But I will not shed more blood today. You shall stand trial, as is the right of any noble. Until then, you shall be confined to your chambers under guard." A ripple of astonishment coursed through the crowd. Some had expected immediate execution. Oberyn's eyes narrowed slightly. He had yearned for Cersei's punishment to be swift, but seeing Daenerys choose a path that upheld justice rather than vengeance gave him a grudging respect for her vision. This was not a queen who would repeat the sins of her enemies. She would grant them the fairness they denied others. Oberyn let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He approached the throne, lifting his spear in salute. Daenerys regarded him with calm gratitude. Though they had different temperaments, they understood each other's hearts. "You have your throne, your grace," Oberyn said softly. "And Westeros has its queen," Daenerys replied, her eyes gleaming. "May we build a realm where the innocent need not fear, and may we see that those who wronged us are made to answer for their crimes, but with justice, not with savage brutality." Oberyn gave a slight, knowing smile. He could live with that. The Lannisters had lost. Elaya's memory would no longer be mocked by their presence on the throne. Though he would have welcomed harsher retribution, he saw in Daenerys's measured approach the seeds of a more lasting, stable rule. The city was hers. The realm would soon follow. The aftermath of Daenerys's ascension was as tumultuous as one would expect. The Tyrells, seeing the writing on the wall, capitulated quickly, securing their domain under a treaty with the new queen. The North, embroiled in its own power struggles, sent envoys to treat with Daenerys, though that would be a longer process, complicated by the Boltons' reign of terror. The Vale, under Peter Baelish, hedged its bets, as it always did, but leaned toward recognizing Daenerys' authority when it became clear the Lannisters were undone. In each negotiation, Oberyn's presence stood as a reminder that Dorne was a powerful ally and that the Targaryen queen was not alone in this conquest. The combination of dragons and Dornish cunning was a fearsome one, not to be crossed lightly. Over time, Daenerys began the work of mending the wounds of a war-torn realm. She placed capable administrators in key positions, many of them freedmen who had proven their loyalty and skill in Essos. She supported the small folk by lowering harsh taxes the Lannisters had imposed. She released Tommen from custody, naming him Tommen Lannister, removing the Baratheon name, and allowing him to live as a ward under her protection. A gentler fate than many had anticipated. Cersei, after a highly publicized trial, was found guilty of multiple crimes and sentenced to spend her days in a solitary cell, away from the politics of the realm. Some called it leniency, others called it justice. In the Red Keep's gardens, amidst the newly planted Dornish sunflowers, Oberyn found himself reflecting on the strange path that had brought them here. He remembered King's Landing from before, its rotten intrigue, his near brush with death in the original timeline. Now, the city hummed with a cautious optimism. The Targaryen banners flew from the ramparts. Freedmen from Essos mingled with Westerosi peasants, exchanging tales of how Daenerys had liberated them all in one way or another. Oberyn no longer felt the same burning rage that once defined him. He had, in a way, fulfilled his mission of vengeance for Elia. House Lannister had fallen from power. The woman who had orchestrated much of their tyranny was imprisoned. Tywin Lannister had already died, though not by Oberyn's hand, ironically enough. In the confusion following the downfall of the Lannisters, rumors said Tyrion Lannister had ended his father's life, but that was a separate matter. The Mountain, Gregor Clegane, had been slain during the wars, and thus every last piece of the puzzle that led to Elaya's death had been shattered. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Daenerys approached, dressed in a simpler gown than usual, her hair left partly unbound. She studied him with curious eyes. "Prince Oberyn, I rarely see you this pensive." He turned to her, smiling faintly. "I was thinking about the cost of vengeance. We have toppled the Lannisters, but the realm remains fragile. Will your new rule bring genuine peace, or just another turn of the wheel?" She joined him on a stone bench, the warm afternoon sun illuminating her hair. "I cannot pretend to have all the answers, but I will try to be the queen who breaks the cycle of bloodshed. I owe that much to the people who suffered under the old regimes, both here and across the sea. And I owe it to you, who placed so much faith in me." Oberyn snorted gently. "I gave you gold because I wanted the Lannisters to burn. But in the process, I found myself believing in something bigger. You freed slaves. You ended old injustices. I've seen how you listen to your advisors and show mercy to your foes. Most of them. If there's a way to lead this realm to a better future, perhaps you'll find it." Daenerys gave a small nod. "And if I falter, I trust you to tell me. Honestly and without fear." He grinned. "Oh, I'll have plenty to say, my queen. A Dornishman is never shy about speaking his mind." They shared a moment of camaraderie, each acknowledging the other's role in shaping this new reality. Daenerys was queen, and Oberyn Martell was now her close counselor and ally, his cunning and passion still as sharp as his spear. Beyond the walls of the garden, the city bustled with the first steps of reconstruction. Freedmen hammered boards onto damaged roofs, gold cloaks, reorganized under a new commander loyal to Daenerys, patrolled the streets, ensuring order. The Red Viper's dream of seeing the Lannisters humbled had come to pass, and now he found himself curiously hopeful for the future. A future that might finally outshine the tragedies of the past. Over the following months, Daenerys consolidated her hold on the Crownlands. She traveled to Highgarden to formally accept the Tyrell's submission, forging an alliance that promised abundant harvests for a realm in need of food. She dispatched envoys to the north to negotiate with the Stark loyalists, if any still held sway, to unify the land in common cause. She arranged for the dissolution of certain Lannister titles, redistributing lands to houses that had suffered under Lannister rule, a gesture aimed at healing old wounds and securing loyalty. Each policy bore a measure of Dornish influence, courtesy of Oberyn and Doran's input. They urged her to respect local customs and not impose harsh subjugation, having learned from how Daenerys handled Meereen's complexities. In time, talk turned to the threat from beyond the wall, rumors of the White Walkers, though that was still a distant concern for many in the south. For Oberyn, the notion of an undead army seemed fantastical, yet Daenerys's unwavering belief in the threat prodded him to gather intelligence. Dornish scouts traveled the roads north, speaking to river folk and mountain clans, seeking any sign of truths in the rumors. Though no final proof surfaced in those early days, Daenerys remained resolute that part of her destiny lay in protecting the entire realm from that unknown terror. All the while, in the Red Keep, Oberyn remained a key figure at court. His children, the Sand Snakes, found positions of respect, Tyene helping to oversee the city's orphanages, which had been neglected for years, Obara training with the new City Watch, Nymeria assisting with diplomatic missions. Ilaria Sand, though initially uncertain about forging a life in the capital that held so many painful memories, found a strange satisfaction in seeing the Lannisters' downfall. She embraced the role of a Dornish envoy, bridging cultural gaps between the newly arrived freedmen from Essos and the people of King's Landing. Though challenges remained, pockets of rebellion by those loyal to the Lannisters, sporadic unrest in regions not fully convinced of Targaryen rule, an overall sense of renewal gripped the realm. Daenerys's reputation as a breaker of chains resonated with the small folk, who had endured the cruelties of warlords and kings. Oberyn's presence as her staunch supporter helped legitimize her claim among the nobility who recognized Dornish independence was never easily granted. If the Martells stood behind Daenerys, she must be worthy of a new age. And so the wheel turned. In this alternate history, Oberyn Martell's decision to seek out and support Daenerys Targaryen in Meereen, to funnel Dorne's gold and cunning into her cause, accelerated her invasion. It brought them both to King's Landing in time to thwart the Lannisters' further entrenchment. The battles were fierce, the alliances fragile, but in the end, the Red Sun and Spear of Dorne stood proudly beside the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen, toppling the lion from its gilded throne. In that new dawn, on the highest balcony of the Red Keep, Oberyn would sometimes stand with Daenerys, both gazing out over the city they had conquered. The rooftops glowed in the morning light, the winding alleys still carrying the echoes of commerce and conversation. Sometimes she would rest a hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of what they had achieved together. And sometimes, when the sun rose at just the right angle, they could see Dornish colors blending with Targaryen black and red banners rippling from tower to tower, and the vision of a queen and a viper shaping the fate of a realm no longer seemed like a fantastical dream, but a living, breathing reality. Such was the legacy of Oberyn Martell's choice. He had risked everything, his pride, his allegiance, his life, to support the last Targaryen sooner than the realm expected. In doing so, he ensured that the war would come on his terms, with Dorne standing at the forefront of retribution against House Lannister. For Dorne, for Daenerys, and for the countless lives changed by this union of desert sun and dragon flame, the future was an open horizon. Storms would come, new enemies would rise, but in that moment of triumph, as the realm bent the knee to its returned queen, Oberyn could finally lay to rest the tortured ghosts of Elia and her children, and look toward the days to come with a measure of hard-won hope. In the weeks that followed the fall of King's Landing, the city began to settle into a tense but genuine peace under Daenerys Targaryen's new regime. The last battle-stained banners of House Lannister were torn down and cast into storerooms, replaced with the triumphant three-headed dragons of House Targaryen. Dornish guards patrolled alongside Unsullied in the streets, ensuring order and, whenever possible, justice. The small folk were uneasy but not hostile. Many had grown weary of the brutality and shortages that accompanied endless war. Now, with the new queen's claim firmly established, there was a chance for hope. Oberyn Martell spent his days moving between sessions of the Queen's Council and the city itself, measuring the pulse of a population that did not yet know what to make of the so-called breaker of chains. He discovered that though many had feared a dragon invasion, the presence of the Dornish prince, already somewhat known in King's Landing from the time of Joffrey's wedding, lent an air of strange familiarity to Daenerys's rule. Some remembered him as the Red Viper who had almost fought Gregor Clegane in Tyrion Lannister's trial by combat. Rumor of that near-duel had lingered even after his supposed departure from the capital. Now that fate had spared him that day, Oberyn was here, alive and brimming with the same mixture of charm and threat that had always defined him. During those first months, Daenerys worked diligently from the Red Keep, conferring with her advisors and forging new alliances. Cersei languished in a guarded chamber, stripped of her royal attire, wearing a simple gown that spoke of her fall from power. Word spread quickly that the former queen would face a formal trial in the coming season, conducted by a gathering of lords, judges, and learned septons who could evaluate her crimes properly. Though some cried that Cersei deserved no trial, that her sins warranted immediate execution, Daenerys insisted that if she were to represent a new era for the realm, she had to demonstrate the rule of law. For Oberyn, that approach felt both admirable and frustrating. Each time he passed the guarded chambers where Cersei was kept, he experienced a surge of anger, recalling what she had done to Elaya's children by aiding Tywin's ambitions and covering for his brutal enforcers. Yet Daenerys had asked that no harm come to the prisoner until the formal proceedings. Oberyn obliged, swallowing his thirst for immediate vengeance. Part of him suspected that justice served cold might still be sweeter when it was done in the open, with every one of Cersei's crimes laid bare. Tommen, meanwhile, had been allowed a quieter life in the Red Keep. Redubbed Tommen Lannister rather than Baratheon, he was assigned a small retinue of loyal attendants who saw to his needs. He was still a boy, lost and uncertain, and Daenerys harbored no wish to punish an innocent for the machinations of adults. Oberyn often glimpsed the child walking with Ser Barristan in the castle courtyards, learning a soldier's discipline in a gentle way, or in the library reading about the histories of Targaryen rule. Perhaps that was Daenerys' subtle method of forging a new generation of Lannisters who could coexist in her realm without poisoning it from within. Beyond the Red Keep's walls, life in King's Landing was slowly improving. Although Daenerys had left behind many freedmen in Meereen, enough had followed her to shape parts of the capital's culture. New markets opened, selling Eastern spices and goods. Freedmen artisans set up shops where they displayed their crafts, forging new connections with local merchants. And yet, the city was far from perfect. The scars of war ran deep. Poor districts remained in disrepair. Crime still lurked in alleyways, and the legacy of the Lannisters' reign made many cautious about trusting any new monarch. Daenerys commissioned repairs to the city walls and the burned-out buildings near Flea Bottom, using a combination of crown funds and, discreetly, some of the Dornish gold that Oberyn still provided. Bit by bit, the capital inched toward a fragile stability. Meanwhile, in the broader realm, letters flew between noble houses, each deciding how to respond to the new queen. The Tyrells acknowledged her ascension swiftly, sending polite missives to congratulate her and reaffirm their loyalty, though few were naive enough to believe that the Tyrell-Lannister alliance would remain anything but severed. Having declared for Daenerys, the Tyrell lords assured her of provisions, grain, livestock, and other critical resources. Mace Tyrell wrote assurances that Highgarden would stand behind the new Targaryen rule. Margaery, once queen to Tommen, remained in the Reach, no longer wearing a crown of any sort but retaining great influence among the Tyrell bannermen. She, too, was said to be open to forging new ties with Daenerys, presumably to keep the Tyrell fortunes high. The North presented a more complicated situation. News of Daenerys' arrival filtered up the King's Road amid rumors of White Walkers, Bolton treachery, and the uncertain fates of several Stark children. The Boltons still held Winterfell, having previously bent the knee to the Lannisters for recognition of their dominion. But with the Lannisters deposed, the Bolton claim to the north was in limbo. At court in King's Landing, Daenerys, Oberyn, and the other counselors debated how to handle the matter. Bolton cruelty was well known. Daenerys had no intention of letting a house infamous for flaying its enemies remain in control of the north. Yet marching an army up into the harsh winter lands, so soon after the capital's conquest, was a daunting proposal. Moreover, there were persistent whispers that a king in the north, some said a resurrected Jon Snow, others said a young Rickon Stark, might be rallying northern bannermen. The rumors were contradictory, difficult to parse. Oberyn pressed for reconnaissance first. We know the Boltons cannot be allowed to thrive, but it's foolish to throw the entire realm into another war. The small folk have had enough bloodshed. Let us send envoys. Let us learn how the winds blow in the north. If there is a true Stark claimant, we might find an ally against the Boltons. Daenerys agreed, dispatching a group of careful emissaries and a few hundred soldiers north to gather intelligence. At the same time, she continued to strengthen her hold on the south, not wanting to overextend. But Westeros was not the only concern. From the Iron Islands came disquieting reports of Euron Greyjoy's ascent. He had cast out or killed those loyal to the old ways under Balon Greyjoy and seized the Seastone chair. Yara Greyjoy and Theon Greyjoy, once bitterly opposed siblings, had apparently fled. If Euron planned to carve out a new empire, Daenerys needed to be prepared. The Ironborn had a long history of reaving and exploitation, and with the Royal Navy still recovering from the war, the coastline could be vulnerable. Thus, even as King's Landing was gradually tamed, Daenerys recognized that several corners of the realm still bristled with danger. In the midst of these political deliberations, Oberyn found rare moments of solace in the capital's gardens or while sparring with his sand snakes. He had brought several of his daughters to the city. Obara, Nymeria, and Tyene were the ones most frequently in his company, while the younger ones remained in Dorne with Doran. Alleria Sand spent much of her time liaising with freedmen communities, bridging cultural gaps with a warm smile and an earnest desire to see the city's neglected populace gain some measure of security. Oberyn marveled at how she turned her own grief and anger, ever sparked by Elia's fate, into compassion for those who had suffered. She had a temperament quite different from his. Where he was all passion and sparks, she could soothe and navigate through empathy. Together, they helped shape a new network of trust, forging bonds that Daenerys would need in the months to come. When the first northbound envoys returned, they brought with them startling news. House Bolton was indeed on shaky ground. Rumor claimed Ramsay Bolton had murdered his father, Roose, and faced rebellion from many northern houses who despised him. Further, some whispered of a large wildling presence south of the wall, led by a man with dark hair and somber eyes, one who might be the bastard son of Ned Stark, raised from death by some northern magic. Others said it was an old wives' tale, a story conjured to rally the faithful to the Stark name. Yet, more practically, the envoys confirmed that pockets of northern resistance burned bright against the Boltons. House Manderley in White Harbor, the remaining Umbers, and perhaps the Karstarks who had grown disenchanted with Bolton cruelty. Daenerys summoned Oberyn and her key advisors. The desire to press northward rose anew, balanced against the knowledge that the realm had just tasted peace. "If we march on Winterfell," she said, pacing near a large map of the Seven Kingdoms, "we risk stirring another war, but the Boltons will never bend the knee willingly, and they remain a threat. The North should belong to the Starks." Ser Barristan Selmy stood to one side, arms folded. "Your Grace, if indeed there is a living Stark rallying the houses, he might accept your rule if you support his rightful claim. The Starks have always been loyal wardens of the North under the Targaryens, at least historically. If you prove you aim to restore the old order, not subjugate them, they may well join you. And if they do not?" Dario Naharis's voice carried from the corner of the room, where he lounged with a casual arrogance. Though Daenerys had left him in Meereen previously in our alternate path, let us assume for the sake of the story he found a way eventually to join her, or that some time has passed and she recalled him. Perhaps a small retcon or logical extension. He grinned. "We can always let the dragons remind them who holds the power." Oberyn frowned. "That sort of approach might work in the short term, but would you truly subdue the North that way? They remember old slights and old alliances. If this bastard of Ned Stark is real, better to work with him, not against him." Daenerys nodded. "I have no desire to set the North aflame. We'll send a fresh delegation with an offer of alliance. In exchange for kneeling to the Iron Throne under House Targaryen, the Starks, or whoever can unify the region, will have my backing to rid themselves of the Boltons. If they refuse, we'll consider another path. But I suspect they won't. The Boltons are hated. My presence could tip the balance in favor of the old northern houses that have yearned for a Stark to return. She looked at Oberyn. I want you among those envoys, Prince Oberyn. Your sense of negotiation, your ability to gauge a man's heart, would be invaluable. Take a modest retinue, your sand snakes if you wish. Assess the north, see if it's truly ready to throw off the Boltons. If so, we'll coordinate a campaign. If not, we may attempt subterfuge. I prefer not to fling armies back and forth across the realm unless absolutely necessary. Oberyn inclined his head. I'll leave as soon as you will it, your grace. Though I warn you, a Dornishman in the north is an odd sight indeed. I'll have to bring a thicker cloak. He spoke with a half-smile, but he recognized the importance of the mission. If he could help broker an alliance, it might spare the realm another ruinous war. That very evening, Oberyn departed, accompanied by Nymeria Sand, Tyene Sand, and a small escort of Dornish spears. They traveled up the King's Road in a swift column, mindful that brigands or displaced soldiers might still prowl the roads. When they reached the Stormlands, they noted the strengthening Targaryen presence in the region. Garrisons had been placed in key castles, ensuring local lords remembered to whom they owed allegiance. Traveling further north, they passed through lands ravaged by older battles, fields scorched, villages half-abandoned. The air grew colder as they ascended into the Riverlands. Now, under the notional rule of Daenerys, the Riverlands still struggled with the aftershocks of the War of the Five Kings, and the outlaws known as the remnants of the Brotherhood without banners occasionally roamed. Yet, for Oberyn, the journey was smoother than he'd anticipated, for most recognized the Targaryen banners he carried, and none wished to provoke the Queen's new champion. Along the route, Oberyn heard new tales of the undead in the far north, of the Wall being a place of gathering gloom. He dismissed some as peasant superstition but could not dismiss them all, not when more than one traveler insisted that the long night was not just a story. Oberyn had never been one to fear bedtime tales. His world was shaped by the cruelty of men, not ice demons, but he wondered if Daenerys' concerns had merit. Perhaps there was a threat that dwarfed mere politics. Eventually, Oberyn's party reached the outskirts of White Harbor, the largest port in the north. Though the Mandalese had historically served the Starks, they were known for a measure of southern courtesy in a land typically austere. The gates were heavily guarded, and the arrival of Dornish riders bearing Targaryen banners drew immediate curiosity. Lord Wyman Manderly's guards let them enter, though with caution. From behind the battlements, countless eyes watched them, uncertain whether these southerners came as conquerors or friends. Lord Wyman greeted Oberyn with the mannered politeness for which Manderleys were famous, though his voice was more subdued than the boisterous rumors about him suggested. Prince Oberyn Martell, he said, gesturing for the Dornishman to join him by a large hearth in the feasting hall. Your presence is unexpected, though I suspect it carries significance. The realm is changed, I hear. A Targaryen sits the Iron Throne once more. Oberyn stood by the fire, grateful for the warmth. The north was colder than anything he'd experienced in many years. Yes, my lord, Daenerys Targaryen has reclaimed her birthright. She sends me north to learn whether the Boltons still hold power here, or whether we might welcome the return of House Stark. Rumors speak of a bastard son of Ned Stark. Are these rumors true? Wyman sighed heavily, eyes shadowed with a mixture of hope and grief. All the North prays for the return of the Starks. There is indeed a bastard, Jon Snow. He was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, but in the chaos at the Wall, rumor says he was killed by mutineers, only to rise again by some miracle. I have heard conflicting accounts. Some say he has joined forces with the wildlings, hoping to fight a threat from beyond the Wall. Others say he has reclaimed Winterfell. The latter I cannot confirm. The Boltons, well, Ramsay Bolton would have you believe he is the rightful warden of the North now. He flayed anyone who spoke otherwise. Nymeria Sand, standing by Oberyn's side, asked in a measured tone. So we do not even know if Winterfell is in Bolton hands or if it has fallen to some rebellion? Wyman shook his head. Communication is poor, the roads are treacherous, and ravens do not always make it. Still, I have had whispered word that House Umber turned against Ramsay. The Karstarks are divided. Many banners remain scattered. It is a time of turmoil. Oberyn leaned forward, resting a hand on the mantle above the hearth. Daenerys Targaryen wishes to see the Boltons removed from power. She believes the Starks are the true wardens of the North. If Jon Snow or any Stark can muster the houses to free Winterfell, the Queen is prepared to offer support. I come to see if that is so, or if we must mount a campaign ourselves. Though the realm is weary of war, the Boltons cannot remain. They were the Lannisters' creatures, and that alone is reason enough to end them. Wyman's face lit with cautious optimism. If Her Grace truly intends to restore the North to the Starks, she would have the gratitude of many houses, including my own. We have bided our time, feigning loyalty to keep our people alive. But the moment we see a clear chance, we will move. If you plan to press further north, I will give you what aid I can. Some roads lead toward Castle Serwyn, which may be held by Bolton men, but you might find them lightly garrisoned. You could potentially reach Winterfell and see for yourself who holds it now. So it was decided. After spending the night in White Harbor, Oberyn and his retinue, expanded by a handful of Manderly guides, ventured deeper into the north. Harsh winds whipped across open fields, carrying the first hints of winter's bite. Along the way, they encountered small folk who spoke in hushed tones of the Bolton flayings, of pink letters and savage hunts. A few refugees insisted that a great battle had been fought near Winterfell, though who had won remained a mystery to them. Others told of sightings of large, snow-white wolves and banners with the direwolf crest on them. As the group pressed on, it became clear that tension gripped the region. After several days of cautious travel, they approached the outskirts of Winterfell. The snow lay thick on the ground, and the old castle loomed in the distance, its walls partially repaired after the damage from prior conflicts. Smoke drifted from a few towers. The gates stood closed, but guards patrolled the battlements, bearing a banner that made Oberyn's heart quicken. A gray direwolf on a field of white. House Stark's standard. Oberyn commanded his party to halt. He raised a white flag of truce as he rode forward with Nymeria Sand at his side. A voice from the walls called out, "Who goes there?" A second voice demanded, "Identify yourselves, or you'll find only arrows for your trouble." Oberyn removed his hood, letting the biting wind scrape his cheeks. "I am Oberyn Nymeros Martell, Prince of Dorne and envoy of Queen Daenerys Targaryen. I come to parley with whomever holds Winterfell in the name of House Stark." For a moment, silence hung. Then a muffled conversation followed among the guards. Eventually, the gates creaked open, and a small party of armed men rode out to meet him. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a thick beard and a solemn expression. On his surcoat, the direwolf crest stood in bold contrast. He introduced himself as Tormund Giantsbane, a wildling chieftain, which took Oberyn aback, for he had never expected to see wildlings manning the walls of Winterfell. Tormund eyed Oberyn with open curiosity. "So, a Dornish prince, eh? I've heard you lot don't like the cold." He gestured to the castle behind him. "You say you come for parley? You best speak to Jon Snow. Or to Lady Sansa if you like. They're the ones making decisions here." Nymeria Sand exchanged a look with her father. The presence of wildlings in Winterfell suggested that if Jon Snow had taken the castle, he had allies from beyond the wall. Rumors of an alliance between the Night's Watch's ex-Lord Commander and the wildlings were apparently true. They rode into the courtyard, greeted by a curious assembly of northerners and wildlings. Old banners of House Stark had been raised over the battlements, though many of the walls still bore scorch marks from recent battles. Large piles of timbers and rubble indicated ongoing repairs. Oberyn dismounted, stepping onto the snowy ground. Eyes tracked him from all sides. The sand snakes and the Dornish spears behind them kept their hands near their weapons, but Oberyn had given explicit instructions to remain calm. This was not an enemy stronghold. The direwolf banner was a sign of potential alliance. From the great hall emerged two figures. The first was a woman with auburn hair and a regal bearing, her face etched with caution. Her garb, though practical for the cold, bore subtle hints of nobility. A gray cloak lined with white fur, the emblem of House Stark pinned at her shoulder. Beside her walked a tall, lean man in dark clothing, a sword at his hip. His eyes were dark gray, and though his face was young, it held a gravity beyond his years. Oberyn recognized him at once from the descriptions. Jon Snow. The woman spoke first, her voice clear. I am Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell, and this is my half-brother, or my brother in truth, Jon Snow. She glanced at Jon with a soft, almost apologetic smile, as though acknowledging that the details of his birth were more complicated than she could easily express. You say you are Prince Oberyn Martell, come from King's Landing in the name of Daenerys Targaryen? Oberyn inclined his head, stepping forward. My lady, my lord, yes, I bring greetings from Queen Daenerys, who now sits the Iron Throne. I come to see who holds Winterfell, and to offer an alliance. She wishes to confirm that the Boltons have been driven out and that House Stark is restored. Jon Snow's expression flickered with relief, though he kept his voice level. Ramsay Bolton is dead. We took Winterfell back with the help of many northern houses and the free folk. He nodded toward Tormund. But the realm is in chaos, and we have concerns that stretch beyond the normal politics of kings and queens. The dead rise in the far north. An army of White Walkers marches on the wall. Oberyn regarded the man carefully. He had heard the rumors, but hearing the threat stated so plainly, in the courtyard of Winterfell, made it more tangible. Still, Oberyn's mind was trained to parse alliances first. Then you may be in need of more than just moral support. Daenerys Targaryen has dragons, 3 of them, and a sizable army. She is prepared to recognize House Stark as Wardens of the North if you will bend the knee and acknowledge her sovereignty. In return, she offers her aid against the Boltons or any other threats. Sansa's gaze hardened slightly. The Boltons are already dealt with. What remains now is the threat beyond the wall. My brother believes it is real. I trust him. But does your queen? Or does she only see a chance to expand her domain? Oberyn was not insulted by her bluntness. He admired it. She takes the threat of White Walkers seriously. She has heard enough stories and respects them more than most southern lords would. But yes, she also believes the North belongs to the Starks by right, under the Iron Throne as in centuries past. She does not wish to subjugate you, but the fealty must be clear if she is to commit her forces. The realm must be united, or it will fall to pieces when this threat arrives. Jon Snow folded his arms. We already bowed to one southern king, indeed many, and we have suffered for it. But if Daenerys is as different as you say, perhaps we can talk. The White Walkers will not be stopped by one kingdom alone. Perhaps we do need the rest of Westeros. But our people won't blindly swear fealty after what we've endured. We'll need to see this queen ourselves, see her intentions, and see if she can spare the men and resources to help us. Winter is nearly upon us. Oberyn's breath came out in a visible puff in the cold air. That's precisely why I've come. To invite you, Lady Sansa, Lord Jon, to journey south, meet Daenerys, and forge a common front. If your warnings about the undead are true, you have much to gain from alliance. And Daenerys, in turn, gains a stable north. Alternatively, we can arrange for her to come north, though bringing dragons all the way to Winterfell in these conditions is no small feat. Sansa and Jon exchanged a long look. The great hall behind them was busy with bustling northerners and wildlings, all listening intently. Sansa turned back to Oberyn. We'll consider your offer. But we cannot simply abandon Winterfell. We've only just reclaimed it. We have to ensure it remains secure, especially with winter coming. And the ravens we've received from the wall suggest that the Night's Watch might already be facing skirmishes with undead whites. Jon's face was grim. I'll go if need be. Sansa can hold Winterfell with the help of the remaining houses. But if I travel south, who will believe my words about the dead? Perhaps I should bring proof. Oberyn arched an eyebrow. What sort of proof? Jon's mouth thinned. If we captured a white and brought it south, would your queen and her court believe us then? Or would they think it some trick? Oberyn mulled over the idea. A white in King's Landing? That would be shocking, to say the least. But it might indeed open more eyes to the danger. If you could manage such a thing safely, Daenerys is not the sort to dismiss evidence. Sounds mad, but this entire threat sounds mad. Very well. If you succeed in bringing a white to the capital, it would ensure the entire realm sees the truth for themselves. Jon looked around at the wildlings and northern lords. We'll need volunteers for such a mission, beyond the wall into the haunted forest. But it might unite the realm behind our cause. He paused, studying Oberyn carefully. Before we settle on that, let us talk further, inside, where it's warmer. I want to learn more of Daenerys, how she came to power, and what sort of queen she truly is. Oberyn nodded. Very well, Lord Snow. Let us talk. In the great hall, they gathered around a long wooden table, warmed by the crackle of hearth fires. Jon and Sansa sat together at the head. Davos Seaworth, who had recently joined their cause, hovered nearby, regarding Oberyn with polite curiosity. Tormund propped himself against a wall, chewing on a piece of salted meat. A few northern lords, including small groups from House Glover and House Mormont, listened in. Oberyn recounted the broad strokes of Daenerys' journey. Her survival in exile, her marriage to Khal Drogo, her acquisition of dragons in the Red Waste, her campaigns against the slave cities of Slaver's Bay, and finally, her alliance with Dorne that brought her to Westeros. He omitted some details about the precise extent of Dornish funding, but made it clear that House Martell had played a crucial role in enabling Daenerys to invade swiftly and topple the Lannisters. The assembled Northerners listened in fascination, many never having heard the Essosi side of the story. Oberyn described Daenerys as both compassionate and fierce, intent on breaking oppressive systems but not given to wanton cruelty like her father, the Mad King. Jon Snow seemed particularly intrigued by the notion that Daenerys had freed thousands of slaves, forging her identity as the breaker of chains. If she truly stands against tyranny, we might find common cause, he murmured. Sansa's features softened slightly when she heard how Daenerys had shown mercy to her enemies in King's Landing, offering trials rather than summary executions. Still, caution lingered in her eyes. When Oberyn finished his account, he said, Queen Daenerys sits the Iron Throne by right of conquest. Yes, but she seeks to unite rather than destroy. She understands that old grudges can tear Westeros apart. She's invited the North to join her not as vanquished foes, but as partners in rebuilding the realm. I believe you'll find her open-minded about the threat in the North. Davos Seaworth cleared his throat. I've seen what ambition does to good men and women. Sometimes it blinds them to the real dangers. If this queen is sincere, perhaps we can indeed ally. But we have no time for politics if the White Walkers breach the wall. We need every sword. Jon clenched his hands on the table. We can't win a war against the dead alone. Even with all the northern houses united, we lack the numbers. And if Daenerys truly has dragons, that might be our best hope. Fire against ice. Sansa, expression solemn, looked at Oberyn. You've delivered your invitation. We'll need to decide who travels south. Let me ask you this plainly. Should we choose to bend the knee, can we trust her to keep us as rightful wardens of the North? Oberyn's voice was firm. Yes, she is not here to supplant the Starks. She knows the North has always respected the Stark lineage, from Torrhen Stark, who once submitted to Aegon the Conqueror, down through the ages. She wants peace and stability, not an endless chain of rebellions. Sansa looked at Jon and offered a tiny nod. In that case, I suggest you go, Jon. You are the one who believes so strongly in the threat beyond the wall. You can speak directly to Daenerys. But take Davos and gather some of our allies. I'll remain in Winterfell to keep it from falling into chaos. If the Queen is as open to reason as Prince Oberyn says, perhaps we will find a path forward. Jon agreed, though Oberyn noticed the tension in the man's voice. Jon would be leaving the seat of his newly reclaimed home, trusting that it would not be overtaken in his absence. But it seemed the only way to bring the North into the alliance swiftly. Time was not on their side if the rumors of White Walkers were true. They settled on a plan. Jon Snow would travel south with Davos Seaworth and a small escort of trusted men. Sansa would remain as Lady of Winterfell, forging alliances with the northern lords who had yet to swear fealty to the new leadership. In the meantime, Tormund and some wildlings would continue patrolling near the wall, gathering information on White Walker movements. If trouble brewed, ravens would be sent immediately. Before finalizing the departure, Jon took Oberyn aside privately. "One more thing," he said, voice low. "If Daenerys demands we bend the knee, I'll do it for the sake of the realm's survival. But my people won't lightly accept a southern ruler, not after all the betrayals. She'll have to show them why she's worthy of their loyalty. She must understand the North is different." Oberyn nodded. "She will. She's been to cold places in Essos. She knows how to win the hearts of those who expect nothing from a ruler but cruelty. You might be surprised how quickly she can earn trust if her deeds match her words." Thus, a week later, Oberyn, Jon Snow, Davos, and their small retinue began the journey south. They rode under a mixture of Targaryen and Stark banners, an unprecedented sight that turned heads in each village they passed. On the road, Jon asked Oberyn many questions about dragons: how large they were, how they fought, whether Daenerys truly controlled them, or if they had minds of their own. Oberyn answered as honestly as he could, describing how Drogon, the largest, was willful and fiercely protective of Daenerys. "But she has a bond with them," Oberyn said. "I've seen it. She's not a tyrant who unleashes them without thought. She's mindful of the harm they can do." In return, Oberyn learned from Jon about the wildlings, about life at the wall, and the terror of facing undead whites. Though Jon's descriptions were chilling, Oberyn found himself grappling with disbelief. The notion of dead men walking, commanded by icy beings, seemed the stuff of legend. And yet Jon's eyes held no trace of falsehood as he spoke of Hardhome, of battles in the snow where the dead rose in droves. "If we don't unite," Jon said, his voice tight, "then everything we've built, every petty war we've fought, will be meaningless when the Night King marches south." As they neared the Trident, the weather grew milder, the land greener. Daenerys had stationed some Targaryen forces in Harrenhal, ensuring the central Riverlands recognized her rule. Their party was granted safe passage and escorted southward. Rumors flew that a Stark was coming to treat with the Dragon Queen, stirring excitement among villagers and knights alike. The fabled North and the legendary Targaryens had not shared the stage so closely since the age of Aegon's conquest. At last, they reached King's Landing. From a distance, Jon took in the city's sprawl, the red walls of the keep, and the harbor bristling with ships. He stared at the fortress of the city's gates, remembering how once it had belonged to Robert Baratheon, his father's old friend. Now the banners of the three-headed dragon snapped in the wind. The gates opened to admit them, revealing streets that still bore scars from the war yet teemed with life. As the party proceeded, escorted by a regiment of Unsullied, small folk watched curiously from the margins. Some recognized the gray direwolf banner and whispered of a northern alliance. When they arrived within the Red Keep, Daenerys greeted them in the throne room. The transformation from the days of Lannister rule was evident. Old tapestries had been replaced with Targaryen sigils, the floor polished to remove grime left by chaos and neglect. Dragons were not present in the throne room itself, but a distant roar outside reminded everyone of their presence. Daenerys stood before the Iron Throne, dressed in a combination of Westerosi finery and the more fitted style she'd adopted in Essos. Her silver-gold hair was braided back, revealing a face that was youthful yet tempered by experience. Ser Barristan and Grey Worm flanked her. Jon Snow approached with Davos at his side. Oberyn stepped aside, letting the new arrivals speak for themselves. The hush in the chamber was profound. Courtiers, freedmen, and lords of the realm alike had gathered to see this meeting of North and South. Jon bowed, though not elaborately. "Your Grace," he said, his voice sure but subdued. "I am Jon Snow, son of Eddard Stark. I come to speak on behalf of the North." Daenerys inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Lord Snow, the realm has heard much of you. They say you are the king in the North." Her tone was careful, testing the waters. Jon hesitated only a moment, My people named me that in the wake of the Bolton's defeat. But I did not come here to debate titles. There is a threat beyond the wall, one that jeopardizes all of Westeros. It's why I'm here, to ask for aid." The queen's violet eyes flicked to Oberyn, who gave a small nod of confirmation. Then she focused on Jon again. "I've heard these tales from Prince Oberyn. He says you believe an army of the dead marches on us. My father was called the Mad King, and yet to many, what you propose sounds madder still." Her voice had a slight edge, though not dismissive. "But I have always tried to weigh counsel carefully, and Oberyn believes you speak truly. So I will hear you out. Speak then. What is this threat, and what would you have me do?" Jon explained again the same speech he had given countless times in the north. White Walkers, whites, the need for dragonglass and unity. He spoke plainly, his posture radiating earnestness rather than polished courtesy. Davos added details about Hardhome and the Night's Watch's losses. Many in the throne room shifted uneasily as they listened. Some still harbored doubts, but Daenerys studied Jon intently, as if measuring each word for honesty. At last she said, "If this is true, then it's not just the North at stake, but all the living. I have heard that dragonglass can kill these creatures. Fortunately, there are large deposits of dragonglass on Dragonstone. If I grant you permission to mine it, would it aid in forging weapons?" Jon nodded immediately. "Yes, we need as many weapons as we can get. We've a few blacksmiths in the north who can rework it, but we'll need more help." Daenerys considered. "Very well, I'll allow you to mine the dragonglass, but I also ask you to bend the knee. The North has always been part of the Seven Kingdoms, and if we must stand together against the dead, we cannot remain divided." A hush fell. Jon's jaw tightened. "I did not come here to pledge my people's freedom away. They chose me to lead them because they want independence from the chaos of the South." Daenerys let out a measured breath. "And I understand their hesitation, but if we do not stand as one realm, how will we face an existential threat? I do not wish to subjugate the North, but I do want your allegiance. I am offering you the means to defend yourselves, dragonglass, my armies, and my dragons, so that we might all live to see the next spring. In return, I expect loyalty." Jon's gaze flicked to Oberyn, then to Ser Barristan, and finally rested on Daenerys. His expression was torn. "My lady sister remains in Winterfell, as do many northern lords who are uncertain of the Iron Throne's intentions. If they see that you genuinely seek to fight alongside us, they may accept your rule. I cannot simply agree to bend the knee on their behalf." Davos cleared his throat. "Your Grace, if I may? Jon is not a man who cares about personal power. He only wants to defend his people. Mayhap you can grant him time to secure the loyalty of the northern houses to you in a formal alliance. Or, if the threat truly is as dire as we believe, perhaps we can come to an understanding. An alliance in fact, if not in name. Once the White Walkers are defeated, you and the North can discuss the final shape of the realm." Daenerys arched an eyebrow. "So you propose a temporary alliance, with no guarantee of fealty afterward?" Oberyn spoke up, his voice smooth. "Your Grace, I believe what Ser Davos suggests is not that you relinquish your claim, but that you offer the North terms that show you are not here to be another tyrant. Show them you are the realm's protector. Let them see your good faith. Allow them the dragonglass. Pledge your troops when the time comes, and in return, Lord Snow will do all in his power to ensure the North stands with you. Perhaps the official kneeling can wait until after the final battle. If we survive." Daenerys studied Oberyn a moment, recalling how his counsel had proven wise in Essos. Then she turned back to Jon. "Would you agree to that?" Jon hesitated, then inclined his head. "I would. My loyalty is to the living. If you prove to my people you are committed to saving them, if your armies fight beside us, then I will advise them to acknowledge your claim once the threat is dealt with. I cannot promise how they'll respond, but I will speak in your favor." A slight smile tugged at Daenerys' lips. "That is fair. Very well, Jon Snow. You may mine the dragonglass on Dragonstone. I'll have my men assist you. We'll prepare for the war to come. If what you say is true, I want my dragons to face these White Walkers. Fire may well be our greatest weapon." Jon exhaled, relief mingled with the heaviness of the subject. "Thank you, Your Grace. The White Walkers are real. You'll see it soon enough, and I pray we can stop them." The tension in the throne room eased. Courtiers began murmuring, uncertain whether to marvel more at the talk of undead armies or at the Queen's willingness to meet a northern lord halfway. The seeds of alliance had been planted. As the formal meeting concluded, Daenerys invited Jon and his companions to stay in the Red Keep while they made arrangements to travel to Dragonstone. Oberyn offered to serve as a liaison, helping Jon understand the capital's intrigues and the local powers that circled Daenerys' rule. Later that evening, in a private solar, Daenerys and Oberyn spoke quietly while courtiers and freedmen bustled about their own tasks. A single candle burned on a table, illuminating their faces. She sipped wine thoughtfully. "He's not what I expected of a northern lord," she admitted. "There's no flattery, no ceremony, just blunt talk and solemn eyes." Oberyn chuckled. "He reminded me of Ned Stark in that way. I met Lord Eddard only briefly in my youth, but the man was famed for his quiet integrity. Jon Snow seems to have inherited that trait." Daenerys set her wine aside. "Do you believe his story about the undead? You've traveled with him. You've seen how passionately he speaks of it." Oberyn sighed. "I've no reason to doubt him. He's not the sort to invent tall tales. I suspect it's real, some monstrous threat beyond the wall. The question is whether we can unite the realm in time. The lords in the south haven't seen these creatures. They won't be easy to convince. And let's not forget the Iron Islands under Euron Greyjoy and the uncertain stance of certain lords in the Reach. This war on the horizon might require more cunning than any of us can muster alone." Daenerys considered. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. In the meantime, you have my thanks for bringing Jon Snow south. If we secure the north in this manner, we spare ourselves another war and focus on the true threat." She leaned back, a pensive look crossing her face. "We also must finalize the trial for Cersei. I want the realm to see that I respect due process, that I'm not my father. But we need lords from across Westeros to serve as witnesses, and many are still traveling or establishing order in their own lands." Oberyn nodded. "Cersei's crimes are numerous. Publicly airing them will help the realm understand why the Lannisters no longer rule. But be prepared for whatever cunning argument she might muster. She may attempt to shift blame or question your legitimacy. She may even call for a trial by combat." Daenerys frowned. "If she does, who would champion her? The Mountain is dead. Jaime Lannister's whereabouts remain uncertain. He vanished around the time of your invasion. If he's alive, he hasn't surfaced. In any case," Oberyn said gently, "you hold the upper hand. This trial will be part of establishing your new era. Show fairness, but do not hesitate if the time comes for sentencing. The realm expects some measure of finality." Daenerys gave a solemn nod. "I will. The last thing I want is a repetition of the War of the Five Kings. We must draw a line under the Lannisters' tyranny." In the following weeks, Jon Snow and his companions journeyed to Dragonstone to begin mining operations. Daenerys flew there on Drogon, impressing Jon with the sheer power of her dragons. Oberyn remained in King's Landing for a time, overseeing small but crucial details of governance alongside Ser Barristan and other members of the Queen's growing council. The city's daily life hummed with a new sense of purpose, as freedmen from Essos mingled with Westerosi merchants, forging an unexpected cultural blend. The harbor thrived under the watchful eyes of Dornish and unsullied patrols, ensuring that unscrupulous smugglers couldn't exploit the flow of goods. One crisp morning, word reached the capital that Euron Greyjoy had launched raids along the western coasts, striking Lannister-held lands that had not yet fully yielded to Targaryen authority. Euron's fleets had grown formidable, rumored to be accompanied by dark sorceries. Some said he had a horn capable of binding dragons to his will. Others dismissed it as superstition. Regardless, the Ironborn threat was real, and Daenerys recognized she had to deal with Euron before he became a thorn in her side during the upcoming war against the undead. She conferred with Oberyn, who in turn spoke with her admirals and the newly restructured royal fleet. While her navy was not as large as she might wish, it was supplemented by the ships Oberyn had secretly funded in Essos. Still, Euron was cunning and ruthless. A direct engagement might be risky. Daenerys decided to send envoys to Pike, demanding Euron's submission and threatening dragonfire if he continued his raids. Euron responded by sending those envoys back in pieces. The letters that arrived soon after taunted the Dragon Queen to come and face him, bragging that his new powers would see her undone. Oberyn scoffed upon reading Euron's boasts. Another fool who thinks mere bravado can protect him from dragon flame. Still, we can't underestimate him. If you send your fleet west, you open the possibility of him slipping behind you and attacking the capital or your supply lines. Daenerys tapped her fingers on a map spread across the war table. I may have to do it in person with the dragons, a show of force that leaves no doubt. But every time I move the dragons away from the capital, I risk something else unraveling. This realm is a tapestry of knots. To add to the complexity, ravens from the north carried worrisome tidings. Scouts reported sightings of whites not far from Eastwatch by the sea, and the wildlings had engaged in skirmishes that tested their defenses. Winter was closing in swiftly. Jon Snow wrote that they had begun forging dragonglass weapons in earnest, but they needed more time and, eventually, Daenerys' armies. Caught between the Ironborn threat, the looming undead menace, and the necessity of holding the realm together, Daenerys convened a grand war council in King's Landing. Jon Snow traveled back down from Dragonstone to join, accompanied by Davos and a few northern lords who had come south to see the Queen for themselves. Lord Yohn Royce from the Vale arrived, representing Peter Baelish's uncertain interests, and Lady Olenna Tyrell came from Highgarden in person, determined to ensure the Tyrells retained enough influence in the new order. Doran Martell, still in Dorne due to his health, sent his envoys in his stead, while Oberyn stood as the Queen's closest Dornish advisor. In the Red Keep's largest council chamber, a ring of lords, knights, freedmen representatives, and key supporters gathered around a circular table. Daenerys presided, flanked by the dragon's presence outside. Periodically, one could hear the rumble of their roars echoing across the city. Tension clung to the air as each faction recognized how precarious the realm remained. Daenerys began. We face threats from the north and west. The White Walkers threaten our very existence, and Euron Greyjoy threatens our unity. We must craft a strategy that does not allow one to derail our efforts against the other. Olenna Tyrell, severe in black mourning clothes for her lost kin, pressed her lips thin. The Ironborn have menaced the coasts for generations. If we do not bring them to heel swiftly, they will harass our supply lines and unravel all we're building. Jon Snow spoke next, his voice quiet but firm. The White Walkers are the greater threat by far. If we don't prepare now, in a few months' time, it won't matter whether Euron raids our coasts, because we'll all be dead. We need to commit to the north, fortify the wall, ensure every able-bodied soldier is ready for that war. Grey Worm, standing beside Daenerys, interjected calmly. If Euron is allowed to strike at our flanks, he could cut off supplies to the north. Armies need grain, steel, and reinforcements. A two-front conflict could prove disastrous. Oberyn, leaning on the table, studied the map. We have 3 dragons. If Daenerys takes 2 of them and decimates the Iron Fleet, that threat may be neutralized quickly. Meanwhile, 1 dragon and part of the royal fleet could remain to guard the capital. Then we move the bulk of our armies north. Or, if we need all dragons to fight the White Walkers, that's another consideration. Daenerys touched a carved dragon figurine on the map, sliding it westward. If I go after Euron with the dragons, I leave the capital more vulnerable. But if we let Euron grow bold, he might strike Lannisport, Fair Isle, or even sail around to the Reach. The Tyrells are already recovering from the previous war. And there's the matter of the trial for Cersei, postponed again and again. I've no wish to let that fester. A hush followed her mention of the trial. Cersei's fate hung like a dark cloud over the realm. Some in the room wanted a swift end to the matter. Others feared a spectacle. Olenna sniffed. My queen, if you won't dispatch the lioness now, at least hold the trial soon. Then you can fix your attention entirely on these threats without having to worry about an old viper coiled in your dungeon." Oberyn's lips curved into a faint smile at her choice of words. Viper. Cersei is dangerous, but her power is spent. It might be wise to schedule her trial soon. Let the realm see justice done. Then we can march forward without lingering doubts about your legitimacy." Daenerys nodded. "Very well. We'll announce that Cersei's trial will take place in 2 weeks' time, here in King's Landing. Lords who wish to bear witness may remain or send representatives. After that is settled, I will personally lead a strike against Euron with 2 of my dragons and enough ships to corner him. We'll end his threat once and for all. Meanwhile, Jon Snow, you and your men can begin transporting dragonglass weapons north, fortifying Moat Cailin and Winterfell in preparation for the coming invasion of the dead." Jon nodded slowly, though a flicker of worry danced across his features. "I only hope we have enough time. The White Walkers won't wait for us to finish our conflicts." Daenerys placed a hand on a carved direwolf figurine. "Nor will I ignore them. Once Euron's threat is contained, we march north, dragons and all. If we must face an army of the dead, we'll do it on the open fields where my children can burn them. Perhaps we'll even meet them at the wall, if that is where they gather." She looked at the gathered lords. "Do we have your support?" One by one they offered assent. Some, like Olenna Tyrell, remained cautious. She wanted to keep her own realm safe, but recognized the Queen's necessity. Peter Baelish's envoys from the Vale offered lukewarm approval, hinting that the Vale would commit once it was certain the realm truly rallied behind Daenerys' cause. The freedmen representatives merely nodded, loyal to Daenerys without question. Jon, speaking for the North, agreed to the plan with an air of grim resolve. Thus, decisions were made. The realm would see Cersei's long-delayed trial. Then the Queen would sail west to deal with Euron Greyjoy, and as soon as that was done, all focus would shift to the north. Those 2 weeks rushed by. Preparations for the trial consumed the Red Keep. Lords from as far as the Stormlands and the Reach arrived to witness, more out of curiosity or political calculation than genuine interest in justice. Some guessed that the Queen might orchestrate a show trial to demonstrate her power. Others hoped for dramatic confessions. Cersei had been given time to prepare her defense, though her means of doing so were limited to the handful of confidants still loyal to her. On the appointed day, the throne room filled with lords, ladies, and knights, leaving hardly enough space for the freedmen and curious small folk permitted to watch from behind a cordon. Daenerys presided from the Iron Throne, flanked by Oberyn, Ser Barristan, and Missandei. Several robed septons from the Faith of the Seven stood ready, solemn in their bearing. Cersei was led in, shackles on her wrists, still wearing a simple gown. Yet even in captivity, she carried herself with regal hauteur, as if daring any to pity her. A hush fell. The septons listed the charges: regicide, the murder of King Robert Baratheon; conspiracy to commit murder, Robert, Marjorie Tyrell, and others; complicity in the deaths of Elia Martell's children, tyranny, and the list went on. As each accusation was read, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cersei's face tightened, but her pride remained unbroken. When given the chance to speak, she spat. "I deny these ridiculous allegations of tyranny. I did only what was necessary to protect my children and the realm. Robert's death was a hunting accident. If there was any scheme, it was my father's or Peter Baelish's. As for Elia Martell's children, that was my father's doing, not mine. I had no hand in it. You slander me with ghosts of the past." Oberyn's fists clenched at those words, but Daenerys silenced him with a gentle raise of her hand. She did not want the trial to devolve into personal vengeance. Instead, she allowed the septons to call witnesses. Many were reluctant, but the changed climate in King's Landing emboldened some who had once feared the Lannisters' wrath. Former servants of the Red Keep spoke of overhearing conversations, seeing letters, or witnessing clandestine meetings. A few older gold cloaks recalled rumors that Cersei's relationship with Robert was so poisonous that she might well have orchestrated his end. Grand Maester Pycelle might have been a witness if he hadn't already perished in the chaos that had ensued during the downfall of House Lannister. Cersei's defense hinged on the idea that there was no solid proof. Much was circumstantial. She claimed her father had acted independently in regards to Elaya's children. She scoffed at the notion that she had personally murdered Robert, accusing others of spinning tall tales. Yet the weight of animosity against her was immense. The realm remembered the cruelty of the Lannisters, the brutality of the Mountain, the horrors inflicted on those who opposed them. Even if the evidence was not perfect, the tide of public sentiment was heavily against her. Finally, Daenerys leaned forward on the throne. "Cersei Lannister, your father's name looms large over these crimes, but you were no innocent bystander. The realm has heard accounts of your manipulations, your willingness to silence, threaten, or eliminate any who stood in your way. I have weighed these testimonies. I am prepared to pronounce judgment." Cersei's eyes flickered with fear, but she forced a sneer. "Go on, then. Sentence me to death and prove you're just another tyrant in Targaryen colors." Daenerys's tone was calm. "You accuse me of tyranny, but I have given you a fair trial. I have listened to your pleas and the witnesses. If I were the tyrant you claim, you'd have been executed without question long ago." She paused. "In recognition of your role in the war and the countless lives lost, I sentence you to execution. It is the will of the crown that your life be forfeit." A collective intake of breath swept the court. Cersei's face twisted into fury. She opened her mouth to shout something, but Daenerys continued, raising her voice. "However, I will not put the realm through a spectacle of brutality. I will grant you a clean death by the sword. Let it be done at dawn tomorrow, witnessed by the lords of Westeros." Cersei's voice trembled with hatred. "You're no different from my father. You'll kill anyone who stands in your way." Ser Barristan stepped forward, cutting off her tirade. Guards seized her arms and pulled her back. Her curses echoed off the walls, raw and bitter, as she was dragged away. Daenerys allowed the hush to linger before dismissing the court. People left in uneasy clusters, some satisfied that justice would be served, others unsettled by the finality of it all. Oberyn watched Cersei's removal with a flicker of relief. Justice for Elia, for Elaya's children, for the countless crimes that had stained the realm. Even if Cersei tried to pass the blame to Tywin, she had played her part in the horrors of House Lannister's reign. That night, an uneasy stillness fell over King's Landing. The dawn execution was planned to be swift and merciful, likely carried out on a scaffold in the Red Keep's courtyard. Daenerys spent the evening in private council with her advisors, double-checking that no last-minute attempt to rescue or free Cersei might occur. Many watchers patrolled the keep. Oberyn took a quiet walk through the courtyard, recalling how once he'd thirsted for this moment, where the Lannisters answered for their crimes. Now that it was at hand, he felt no jubilance, only a somber sense of inevitability. Vengeance did not bring back the dead, but perhaps it helped close the door on an old chapter of blood. At first light, lords and onlookers gathered in the courtyard. Grey Worm escorted Cersei forward, her wrists bound. She had dark circles under her eyes, her hair unkempt, but she still held her head high, as if defying the world to break her spirit. Daenerys stood at a platform's edge, a contingent of Unsullied on either side. Oberyn was to one side, arms folded, expression inscrutable. Cersei scanned the crowd, her gaze landing on Oberyn. She managed a bitter smile. "Enjoy your spectacle, Dornish Viper. You got your wish." Oberyn merely held her gaze without flinching. "Your father's legacy ends here," he said quietly. "No one outruns justice forever." Cersei's only response was a harsh laugh. Then she turned to Daenerys. "You think this will wash the blood from your hands, Targaryen? You burned your way to this throne just as your forefathers did." "You!" Grey Worm gripped her shoulders, cutting the tirade short. A hooded executioner stepped forward, sword in hand. The Septons began chanting prayers for the dead. Daenerys raised a hand, signaling that the sentence was to be carried out. Cersei's voice rang out one final time, filled with venom, but also a twisted, frantic desperation. "You are a fool if you think the realm will follow you willingly. You." Her words halted as the sword swished down. The blow was clean, severing her head in a swift stroke. A hush descended. The Septons concluded their prayers, and unsullied guards removed the body. Some watchers bowed their heads in reverence or relief. Others stared silently, uncertain what to feel. Daenerys remained calm, though her knuckles had whitened on the railing of the platform. She turned and walked back into the keep, leaving Oberyn and the rest to disperse the crowd. Thus ended Cersei Lannister, daughter of Tywin, mother of kings. The repercussions of that moment echoed through the city. Some lamented that Cersei had not been given a more torturous end, especially those who still reeled from Lannister atrocities. Others thought the queen had shown remarkable restraint. But by midday, King's Landing buzzed with the realization that the last major figure of Lannister tyranny had been brought to a definitive end. Tommen, now just Tommen Lannister, was reportedly in seclusion, taken under the care of Septons to grieve his mother's death. Daenerys instructed that no harm come to him. He was to remain a ward of the crown, free to live but with no claim to the throne. After the trial's conclusion, Daenerys wasted no time setting the next phase of her plan in motion. She ordered her fleet and 2 of her dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, to prepare for departure within days. Viserion, the smallest of the 3, would remain in King's Landing under Grey Worm's oversight, a potent deterrent against any unrest in her absence. The goal: sail west, locate Euron's fleet, and destroy it. With Euron subdued, the realm could focus on the north and the threat of the White Walkers. Jon Snow prepared to return north himself, to oversee the distribution of dragonglass weapons and rally the northern lords for the coming winter battles. Oberyn stood at the harbor as Daenerys' ships were ready. The salty wind whipped his dark hair. He was to accompany her, of course, her closest Dornish ally, a skilled fighter, and a diplomat who had already proven his worth in forging alliances. Ellaria Sand would remain behind to help govern the capital, along with Ser Barristan and Missandei. Daario had been left behind in Essos in one version of events, but in this telling might be assigned to the capital's defenses or some other role. There were many variations. However it fell, Daenerys was determined to bring only those who could contribute directly to the campaign at sea. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Daenerys joined Oberyn at the waterfront, where the hull of her flagship rocked gently. Drogon's distant silhouette soared across a pink-streaked sky. "Are you ready for another battle, Prince Oberyn?" she asked quietly. "One more step toward forging the realm we need?" He turned to her, the corners of his mouth curving in a small, wry smile. "I've waited my whole life to see House Lannister undone. Now that it's done, I find there's more to fight for than just vengeance. If we do not unite, if Euron or these White Walkers tear us apart, all we've built crumbles. I stand with you, my queen." She nodded, gaze drifting over the cluster of sails lining the harbor. "We sail at dawn. May the winds favor us." She paused, exhaling softly. "You know, when I first dreamed of taking back Westeros, I never imagined how many difficulties would wait beyond just seizing the throne. But I also never imagined I'd have allies like you or Jon Snow or the freedmen from across the sea. Perhaps that is our strength, this tapestry of differences woven together. A tapestry that can still tear if we're not careful," Oberyn said gently. "But I believe in what we are shaping here. Let us hope the realm believes as well." With that, they parted to finish their preparations. At dawn, the fleet set sail. Daenerys personally rowed Drogon above the ships, an awe-inspiring sight for the men who rowed and manned the sails. Rhaegal flew beside Drogon in formation, the 2 dragons scanning the horizon for signs of an enemy. Oberyn stood on the deck of the flagship, feeling the salt spray on his face. He remembered voyages to Essos in his youth, the swirl of exotic ports, the promise of adventure. But now the stakes were higher than any personal escapade. The fate of Westeros hinged on the next battles, each as critical as the last. They navigated the waters around the southern coast, heading toward the Sunset Sea. Word reached them that Euron's raiders had been sighted near the Shield Islands, terrorizing trade ships and smaller villages. Daenerys' fleet changed course, following the Ironborn's trail. dragons soared overhead, scanning for the Iron Fleet. The first skirmish came when a small group of Ironborn ships tried to ambush Targaryen scouting vessels in a narrow channel. A short, brutal naval battle ensued, the Targaryen ships unleashing their ballistae while Rhaegal swooped down to set the Ironborn decks aflame. Oberyn, on the flagship's deck, watched the spectacle. He had never before seen dragons used in maritime warfare. The results were devastating. The Ironborn ships, built to intimidate coastal villages, were no match for dragon fire from above. Wooden hulls and sail rigging ignited like tinder. The few Ironborn who survived the flames dove into the sea. Some tried to surrender, others drowned. Daenerys allowed the surrendering men to be pulled aboard but had them chained, uncertain if they could be trusted. In the aftermath, one captured Ironborn ranted about Euron's new power. "He's not like any lord we've known," the man said, face blackened with soot. "He's touched by dark forces, or so the tales say. He means to claim your dragons with some enchanted horn. He said as much to us." Daenerys and Oberyn exchanged a worried look. She had heard the rumors before, but it was hard to imagine that any horn could truly control dragons. Magic in Westeros was not fully understood, especially after the return of dragons seemed to stir old powers. Daenerys simply said, "He will fail if he tries. My bond with my dragons cannot be severed by parlor tricks." Oberyn rested a hand on his spear. "Yet we must remain vigilant. Dark illusions can weaken an army's resolve, even if they lack true power." They pressed on, heading further west, scanning the seas for Euron's main fleet. By now, the Iron Fleet had grown large under Euron's rule, partially by absorbing smaller reaver bands and capturing merchant ships. Some spies reported that Euron lurked near Fair Isle, planning a grand ambush for the Targaryen forces. Daenerys, determined to confront him directly, steered her vessels toward that area. On the morning of the rumored confrontation, a thick fog clung to the water, muting the sounds of creaking wood and fluttering sails. Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, but even the dragon's keen senses struggled in the haze. Rhaegal flew in wide arcs, his emerald scales glinting whenever the sun broke through. The Targaryen ships advanced cautiously, rowers tensing, ballista crews scanning the mist for silhouettes. Suddenly, a horn blast echoed across the waves, a guttural, eerie note that made some men flinch. The water stirred with the approach of Euron's war galleys, their sails emblazoned with kraken sigils. One by one, dark shapes appeared through the fog. Battle cries rang out. The Iron Fleet had arrived. At once, Daenerys signaled her ships to form a defensive line, while Drogon roared and dove to unleash fire on the lead Ironborn vessel. The flames tore through the deck, sending splinters skyward. But then came another horn blast, deeper and more dissonant, echoing in the sky. Drogon jerked mid-flight, shaking his head as though pained. Rhaegal let out a confused shriek, tail lashing. On the Targaryen flagship, Oberyn clutched the railing, eyes wide. Could the stories of a dragon-controlling horn be true? Euron's flagship came into view, a monstrous vessel with black sails, spiked prows, and a figurehead carved into the shape of a kraken's maw. Standing on the forecastle, clad in dark leather and wearing a blood-red cloak, Euron Greyjoy held a twisted horn to his lips. He blew again, the noise reverberating like thunder. Drogon roared, swirling overhead, wings buffeted by an unseen force. Rhaegal circled uncertainly, as if caught between obeying Daenerys' call and responding to this otherworldly sound. Daenerys tightened her hold on Drogon's saddle, leaning low to speak soothingly to her mount. She had faced rebellious behavior from her dragons before, but never had she seen them so confused. She guided Drogon away from the horn's direction, urging him to focus on the fight below. Slowly, Drogon's wild thrashing subsided. Rhaegal, too, found his bearings, though both seemed agitated. Euron laughed manically on the deck of his flagship, brandishing the horn like a triumphant war prize. Meanwhile, the battle raged among the ships. Ironborn vessels rammed into Targaryen galleys, grappling hooks latching onto rails, swords flashing. Oberyn's flagship became locked in close combat with a pair of Reaver ships. As the hulls crashed together, Ironborn spilled onto the deck. Oberyn drew his spear, meeting their charge with lethal precision. He spun across the wet planks, skewering one Reaver through the chest before lashing out at another. The deck became slick with blood and seawater. Dornish spearmen fought at his back, holding the line against the savage Ironborn. All the while, that eerie horn blasted intermittently, each note seeming to reverberate in the chests of every living creature on the battlefield. Daenerys, from high above, could see the Ironborn rally around Euron's flagship. She knew that if she could destroy that ship and the horn, she might break their spirits. Summoning Drogon's resolve, she urged him into a diving strike. The black dragon roared, flames licking at his fangs, and plummeted toward Euron's vessel. But Euron seemed prepared. His deck bristled with scorpions, large ballistae loaded with heavy bolts. As Drogon dove, they fired. One bolt grazed Drogon's flank. Another struck his side, glancing off a scale but drawing blood. Drogon shrieked in pain, twisting away. Daenerys' eyes widened in alarm as the impact jolted her in the saddle. She fought to maintain control, urging Drogon not to retreat entirely but to circle around for another pass. Fear gnawed at her heart. She remembered the flight wounds Drogon had suffered beyond the narrow sea. She felt his pain through their bond. Rhaegal, emboldened by the sight of Drogon's near miss, joined the fray. The green dragon unleashed a torrent of flame on one side of Euron's ship, incinerating the Scorpion crew. But again that horn bellowed. Rhaegal's flight wavered as if buffeted by an invisible wind. Euron lifted his arms, laughing amid the swirling smoke, as if he believed himself unstoppable. Down on the water, Oberyn managed to dispatch the last group of Reavers on his deck, panting from exertion. He spotted Euron's flagship in the distance, wreathed in fire and smoke, with dragons circling overhead. He shouted to his helmsman, "Steer toward that monster. We need to help the queen." The helmsman complied, though the battered Targaryen ship struggled to break free of the Ironborn grappling lines. Men cut ropes and battered at hooks to free the vessel. Slowly, they inched forward, determined to aid Daenerys. Drogon, wounded but still furious, descended again with Daenerys urging him onward. She guided him to target the prow of Euron's flagship, unleashing a wave of flame that engulfed the hornblower stationed beside Euron. The deck erupted in screams as men caught fire, the wood crackling under intense heat. Euron leapt aside just in time, losing his hornbearer to the conflagration. The vile horn dropped from the man's charred hands, rolling across the smoldering deck. Smoke and flame consumed half the vessel. Still, Euron refused to yield. He grabbed the horn with a gloved hand, ignoring the heat scorching its surface. With a wild gleam in his eye, he raised it to his lips again. This time, however, a spear arced through the air from below. Oberyn's spear. He had climbed onto a ballista platform on his own ship, harnessing it like a makeshift catapult to hurl his weapon with deadly force. The spear struck Euron's arm, slicing open the flesh and knocking the horn from his grip before he could blow it. Euron howled in pain, dropping to one knee. Blood spattered across the deck. Seeing her opening, Daenerys directed Drogon into a final diving sweep. Drogon's roar drowned out the din of battle as he expelled a torrent of flame directly onto the Ironborn flagship. The blazing inferno swallowed Euron's ship, devouring mast, sail, and men alike. Euron, pinned by his wound, tried to scramble away from the spreading fires, but the heat was relentless. The last anyone saw of the crow's eye was his silhouette wreathed in flames, bellowing a final curse at the sky. Moments later, a great explosion of sparks tore through the flagship as ammunition and flammable substances ignited. The horn, presumably, was lost to the flames. With Euron's vessel destroyed, the rest of the Ironborn faltered. Some tried to flee, but Rhaegal and Drogon descended upon them, scorching their decks. Targaryen ships, emboldened by the shift in momentum, pressed the attack, ramming and boarding. Within an hour, the battle was effectively over. The remnants of the Iron Fleet were in disarray, some burning, some sinking, and others striking their banners in surrender. Daenerys guided Drogon to land on a wide, rocky shore near where the conflict had taken place. She dismounted shakily, running her hand over Drogon's side, feeling the warmth of his scales and the sticky blood from the bolt strike. "Easy, my child," she whispered, blinking away tears. "We've won. It's over." Drogon let out a tired rumble, settling his massive body onto the stony beach. Oberyn's ship rowed ashore in a small landing craft, carrying him and a few Dornish spearmen. The battered spear that had struck Euron's arm was lost in the sea, but Oberyn had retrieved a spare. He rushed to Daenerys, looking her over. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, breathing hard. "Only a few scrapes. Drogon took a hit from a bolt. We need to tend to him, but it's done. Euron and his horn are gone." Oberyn nodded, relief flooding his expression. He glanced at the drifting wrecks of ironborn ships, the air thick with the smell of char and salt. "You've saved the western coasts from a terror. The lords of the Reach and the Westerlands will be grateful, if they have any sense." Daenerys, regaining her composure, looked at the horizon, where the sun was climbing higher. "Now we can turn our attention to the true threat. We'll leave a small force to mop up any ironborn stragglers, but the war in the north calls." She turned to Oberyn, eyes solemn. "We must gather all we have, dragons and men, and march beyond the neck. Winter is here." He nodded. "I'll ride with you, my queen, until this final war is won." So it was that the Targaryen fleet, though battered, emerged victorious. The destruction of Euron Greyjoy's armada removed a major obstacle to unifying Westeros under Daenerys' banner. Word spread quickly of how the Dragon Queen, with help from the Red Viper of Dorne, had incinerated the Ironborn's most fearsome captain. Many in the Westerlands and the Reach breathed a sigh of relief, and some who had wavered about pledging loyalty to Daenerys now bent the knee without hesitation. Returning to King's Landing for a brief respite, Daenerys found the city calm. Illyria Sand and Ser Barristan had kept order while she was gone, and Viserion had effectively deterred any notion of rebellion. News of Euron's defeat caused further celebrations in the streets. Yet the Queen did not linger to bask in victory. Almost immediately, she ordered a march northward. Troops from the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and the Reach would muster at the Trident, and from there push on to Winterfell. Dragons and freedmen would join them, forging a massive force the likes of which had not been seen since Robert's rebellion. Houses from all across the realm sent levies, some out of genuine loyalty, others out of fear. Only the Vale remained partially aloof, but even they dispatched some men under the banner of Lord Royce, who believed in the White Walker threat after hearing repeated testimonies. Thus began the greatest movement of armies in a generation. Tens of thousands marched, carrying wagons of dragonglass weapons, storehouses of provisions, and the hopes of a newly unified realm. Jon Snow, who had traveled back north, rallied the northern lords at Winterfell, urging them to welcome Daenerys' forces. Some northerners grumbled about an invading southern army, but the persistent threat of winter and their hatred of the Boltons kept most from voicing outright defiance. Bit by bit, the tension eased as word spread that Daenerys had indeed destroyed the Iron Fleet and executed Cersei, the last lion who might threaten them. Oberyn rode near the front of Daenerys' column, spear in hand, scanning the bleak horizon. Already the land showed signs of encroaching winter, brown fields, early frosts, a pale sun that offered little warmth. He was far from his home in Dorne, from the sun-baked deserts and warm breezes, yet he felt a stirring in his chest. This war, whatever its outcome, might redeem Westeros from its cycle of petty civil conflicts. If men from Dorne, the Reach, the Crownlands, the Riverlands, and the North stood side by side against a common foe, perhaps the realm would learn unity at last. At Moat Cailin, the southern army was met by Jon Snow, Ser Davos, and a contingent of northerners. The old stronghold, though mostly ruins, served as a checkpoint on the narrow causeway leading into the true north. Jon greeted Daenerys formally, acknowledging her as queen. She dismounted from Drogon, the great black dragon looming behind her, and clasped Jon's arm. "It's good to see you alive and well, Jon Snow." He inclined his head. "We've fortified Winterfell as best we can, but the White Walkers could come any day. Scouts say the dead are gathering in the region of the Last Hearth. Houses Umber and Karstark have joined us, but they're badly outnumbered." Daenerys studied the bleak stretch of land. "Then we'll move swiftly. If we can engage them before they reach Winterfell, all the better. I want open ground for my dragons." Oberyn gazed northward, the chill wind tugging at his cloak. Despite the mass of men at Daenerys' command, an unspoken dread hung in the air. They were venturing into a war with an enemy they barely understood, creatures of ice and death that did not fear pain or yield to reason. Even dragons, terrifying in their power, had never faced an army of whites in living memory. Yet Daenerys showed no sign of hesitation. She ordered the march to continue, telling Jon Snow that she trusted his guidance on how best to position the troops. She also called for any living rangers from the Night's Watch to serve as scouts. Night fell with an icy hush. Camping at Moat Cailin, Daenerys convened a smaller council in a tent warmed by braziers. Jon, Oberyn, Grey Worm, Davos, and various lords huddled around a map of the north. The plan took shape. Daenerys and her dragons would lead a vanguard that lured the White Walkers into open ground south of Winterfell. Archers, armed with dragonglass arrows, would form lines behind trenches. Infantry, also armed with dragonglass-tipped spears, would wait for the Whites to close. If possible, they would attempt to draw out the White Walkers themselves, those who commanded the dead. Rumor said that if a White Walker died, the Whites it had raised might fall as well. It was, by all accounts, the greatest gamble of their lifetimes. They had no illusions about an easy victory, but if they could break the White Walkers here, they might spare the entire realm from an endless winter of death. In the days that followed, the huge army pressed further north, setting up supply lines and distributing dragonglass weapons. Morale wavered under the constant cold. The men from the south, especially the Dornish, were unaccustomed to such biting winds. Yet Oberyn and the Dornish spearmen carried themselves with an air of proud resilience, refusing to be shamed by the cold. They wore heavier furs than normal, but their spirit remained fierce. The freedmen from Essos found the north similarly harsh, though they, too, endured. Over the centuries, armies from across Westeros had marched in the south, but rarely had such a diverse force ventured into the domain of snow and ice, standing together to protect a land that few had even seen before. Finally, the scouts brought dire news. The White Walkers were on the move, pushing south past the Last Hearth. The combined forces had only a day or two to form their battle lines near Winterfell. Daenerys insisted they meet the undead there rather than risk letting them pass further. Jon Snow and Sansa Stark greeted the southern armies at Winterfell's gates. Tormund Giantsbane and other wildlings lined the ramparts, giving Daenerys strange, wary looks. The presence of dragons overhead awed even the hardiest wildlings, for many had never seen such beasts. Sansa bowed to Daenerys, though with a stiff politeness, acknowledging that the queen had upheld her end of the bargain by marching north. Oberyn noticed the tension between Sansa and Daenerys, two women with strong leadership qualities, and used to sharing authority. But in that moment, they both recognized the need to unite. Thousands of men assembled in the Fy, elds outside Winterfell's walls, constructing defensive lines and watchtowers. From overhead, Rhaegal and Drogon circled restlessly, occasionally landing to rest. Viserion, still in King's Landing, might arrive later if needed, depending on the outcome of the battle. But the journey was far and time was short. At dawn, a horn blast echoed from a northern watchtower. The scouts had spotted movement, a blizzard rolling in unnaturally fast, accompanied by a vast, shadowy mass. Daenerys and Jon, standing atop Winterfell's battlements, exchanged a grave look. This was it. The host of the dead had arrived. Oberyn, stationed with the forward lines, felt a chill unrelated to the weather coil in his stomach. As the swirling snow advanced, shapes within became visible, hundreds, then thousands of whites, moving in uneven clusters, eyes gleaming with blue malice. Towering among them were pale figures on undead horses, white walkers wielding spears of ice. The sight was enough to make even seasoned warriors blanch. But the lines of living men and women held firm, mustering courage drawn from the presence of dragons in the skies above. A single, solitary shriek split the air. Drogon, unleashed by Daenerys, diving from above with a roar that sent waves of hot breath over the snowy field. A torrent of dragon flame cut a swath through the front ranks of whites, igniting them in eerie greenish-blue fire as the cold of their flesh reacted with the intense heat. Rhaegal followed suit. The White Walkers on horseback scattered, raising their icy weapons, as though summoning gusts of frost to quell the flames. Then the undead horde charged, a cacophonous wave of thrashing limbs and growling throats. Archers loosed dragonglass arrows, cutting down dozens of whites. But the momentum of the dead was terrifying. Clambering over their fallen, whites rushed the trenches where spikes of dragonglass had been set. Some impaled themselves, but others crawled over, forming hideous bridges of corpses. The living braced themselves, spears lowered. Oberyn, near the front, led a unit of Dornish spearmen. He had replaced his old metal spear tip with a dragonglass point. As the first whites slammed into the line, he lunged, impaling a snarling corpse that tried to seize him. The dragonglass flared with a faint, crackling energy as it destroyed the necromantic force animating the white, leaving it limp on the ground. All around him, men shouted, weapons clashed, and the freezing wind carried the stench of death. The freedmen from Essos fought shoulder to shoulder with northern warriors, a bizarre union that under any other circumstance might never have occurred. In the sky, Daenerys directed Drogon to target concentrations of whites, but the swirling blizzard made it difficult to see. Rhaegal, following suit, dove and breathed fire across a cluster near the east flank. Yet as they attacked from above, a White Walker advanced below, lifting its frost-tipped spear. With inhuman strength, it hurled the spear toward Rhaegal. The icy projectile slashed across the dragon's flank, leaving a streak of black blood in the snow. Rhaegal roared in pain, careening away from the battlefield momentarily. Daenerys, alarmed, guided Drogon to protect Rhaegal. This reduced the intensity of the aerial attacks, and the whites began overwhelming the forward lines. Oberyn felt the surge, with a half-dozen whites rushing him at once. He whirled, stabbing one in the skull and decapitating another with a swift slash from a short dragonglass dagger. Their bodies collapsed instantly, as though the magic animating them had been snuffed out. But more came from behind, shrieking, scratching, biting. A freedman soldier to Oberyn's left screamed as a white tore out his throat. Blood spattered the snow. Nymeria Sand rushed in, using twin daggers to dispatch the attacking white, but the soldier was already gone. All across the field, pockets of living warriors struggled valiantly, but the press of the dead seemed endless. Jon Snow, down on the west flank, led a charge of northern cavalry with dragonglass lances. They trampled hundreds of whites, but were forced to retreat when they nearly collided with another wave. The only saving grace was the presence of dragons. Whenever Drogon or Rhaegal swept down and blanketed a zone with flame, a chunk of the undead horde vanished. But each pass risked spears from the White Walkers, and the freezing gale, seemingly conjured by the others, only grew stronger, swirling snow that blinded archers and slowed the living. Over an hour into the brutal melee, the living had lost ground, retreating closer to Winterfell's walls. Daenerys landed Drogon behind the lines, rallying the men. She dismounted, urging them not to break. Grey Worm commanded the Unsullied in tight phalanxes, trying to form a new defensive perimeter. Oberyn, battered and smeared with gore, stumbled back from the front ranks, panting for breath. His spear tip was chipped, the dragonglass fragile from repeated impacts. He scanned the swirling chaos for a sign of victory, or at least hope. Suddenly, a fierce gust of wind parted the snowy curtain, revealing a figure on an undead horse, the Night King. Tall, gaunt, and crowned by twisted horns of ice, he surveyed the battlefield with eerie calm. In his hand, he held a spear of crystallized ice. A group of White Walkers rode behind him, silent and malevolent. The living forces recoiled at the sight. Even Drogon growled from behind Daenerys, as if sensing a presence that threatened them all. Jon Snow, from across the field, locked eyes with the Night King. He rushed forward, Longclaw in hand, his Valyrian steel blade. Sensing a chance to deal a decisive blow, Jon aimed to cut the head off the serpent. But the Night King merely raised his arms, and a new wave of corpses stirred from the piles on the field, rising up, rejoining the fight. Dead men who had only just fallen to dragonglass wounds reanimated in twisted forms. The morale of the living wavered, their painstakingly achieved kills undone in an instant. Before despair could fully grip them, Daenerys cried, "Dracarys!" She mounted Drogon once more, rising into the sky despite the fear of the Night King's spear. Drogon unleashed a torrent of flame upon the Night King, bathing him in a pillar of blazing fire. Oberyn shielded his eyes from the intense glare. The flames roared, melting the top layer of snow around the White Walker formation. For a moment, it seemed everything in that radius had to be destroyed. But as the flames died down, the Night King remained, unscathed, his icy skin radiating a frosty aura that repelled the fire. He stared up at Daenerys with a grim, knowing expression. Then he hurled his spear. Daenerys wrenched Drogon to the side, narrowly evading the deadly projectile, which soared off into the blizzard. The Night King began advancing, an otherworldly presence, each step chilling the air further. Jon Snow reached the circle of White Walkers around the Night King, engaging them in a furious sword fight. Valyrian steel clashed against ice, sending shards flying with each strike. Jon felled one White Walker, shattering it to icy fragments that scattered across the snowy ground, but others closed in. He fought bravely, each swing measured, determined, but heavily outnumbered. Davos, Tormund, and a handful of others rushed to aid him, trying to break through the Whites. Across the field, Oberyn rallied a group of Dornish and Freedman warriors, pressing toward that same point. He sensed that if the Night King were not stopped soon, the living would be overrun. Hardening his resolve, he replaced his chipped spear with a fresh dragonglass-dipped one from a fallen soldier. Step by step, he pressed through the swirling dead, ignoring the biting cold. Nymeria sand and Tyene sand followed him, slicing down Whites with lethal efficiency. Men from the Reach, the Stormlands, and the North joined the press. At last, Oberyn and his group converged on Jon Snow, who was locked in combat with two White Walkers at once. One lunged with a frosty blade, which Jon barely parried. The other circled around, seeking an opening. Oberyn thrust his dragonglass spear into the second's flank, the tip lodging in the cold flesh. A shriek of unholy rage erupted from the walker, which shattered moments later, falling into fragments of ice. Jon seized that chance to dispatch the first with a slicing blow to the neck. Panting, Jon locked eyes with Oberyn. They offered each other a small, grim nod, but any sense of triumph vanished as the Night King rode nearer, chilling wind swirling around him. He dismounted the undead horse and strode forward, unhurried, as if certain of victory. The Whites parted for him, forming a ring around the living as though caging them in for slaughter. Daenerys, overhead, shouted a desperate command to Drogon and Dove again, attempting a second wave of fire. But the Night King lifted his arms, summoning a vortex of ice and snow. The flames battered uselessly against the swirling cold, scattering embers across the battlefield. Drogon roared in frustration, forced to pull away to avoid the White Walker's spear. Oberyn gripped his spear, stepping alongside Jon. Around them, a handful of battered warriors formed a circle, prepared for the Night King's onslaught. The air crackled with unnatural power, as if winter itself had come alive. The Night King drew a sword of ice, stepping forward. He glided with inhuman speed, swinging the blade at Jon, who barely deflected it with Longclaw. The shockwave of the clash sent both men staggering. Oberyn lunged, thrusting his dragonglass spear at the Night King's flank. In a fluid motion, the ancient being pivoted, knocking Oberyn's weapon aside with terrifying strength. The spear shaft cracked under the impact, the blade shearing away. Nymeria's sand darted in, hoping to land a blow with her daggers, but the Night King flicked a hand, sending a blast of icy wind that flung her back. Tyene rushed to her side, dragging her out of reach of the surrounding whites. A wave of undead tried to close in, but Daenerys's remaining ground forces poured forward, creating a swirling melee that parted again around the Night King, who seemed unstoppable. Jon pressed the attack, swinging relentlessly at the Night King's defenses. Valyrian steel clashed with ice again and again, sending shards flying. But each time Jon found an opening, the Night King parried with supernatural reflexes. Meanwhile, Oberyn retrieved the broken remains of his spear, cursing under his breath. He had one last dragonglass dagger sheathed at his belt. He drew it, eyes narrowed with determination. If the Night King could be wounded, even for a moment, perhaps Jon's Valyrian steel could finish him. He signaled to Jon with a quick gesture, then darted behind the Night King, ignoring the swirl of whites that threatened to pull him down. Jon feinted high. The Night King moved to block. Oberyn lunged low from behind, aiming for the Night King's unprotected side. For a fraction of a second, it looked as though the plan might succeed. The dagger's point grazed the Night King's flank, eliciting a faint crackling hiss. But at that critical moment, the Night King twisted away, turning his cold gaze on Oberyn. He seized Oberyn's wrist with a grip like a frozen vice, and the Dornishman gasped at the numbing pain. The Night King pressed his blade to Oberyn's throat, an instant away from ending him. Jon roared in desperation and swung Longclaw in a mighty arc at the Night King's head. The ancient foe released Oberyn, whirling to meet Jon's strike. Ice sword and Valyrian steel met in a ringing clash. But this time, with the slight damage from Oberyn's half-grazing dagger, the Night King's defense faltered. A spiderweb of cracks spread along the ice sword, and Jon's blow carved through, shattering the blade. Momentum carried Longclaw into the Night King's chest. For a heartbeat, the creature stood there, impaled, eyes wide and blazing blue. Then the glow faded, replaced by a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the wound. In an explosion of ice fragments, the Night King disintegrated, vanishing into the howling wind. Silence. For a surreal moment, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if a spell had been broken, whites all across the field collapsed where they stood, their animating force severed. The White Walkers that had remained had similarly shattered or vanished. The living stared in disbelief as the once ferocious undead horde crumbled into lifeless corpses. Dawn's weak light filtered through the swirling snow, revealing the carnage of the battlefield. Heaps of bodies, broken weapons, patches of scorched earth. But the dead no longer stirred. Jon Snow fell to his knees, Longclaw clattering from his grip. Exhaustion and relief battled in his eyes. Oberyn dropped beside him, clutching his frostbitten wrist, wincing from the pain. Around them, survivors began to realize that the battle was over. A wave of mixed cheers and sobs spread across the field. Men embraced each other, weeping. The war for the dawn, as some would later call it, had been won, at least on this day. Daenerys dismounted from Drogon, who landed nearby with a weary roar. She picked her way through the drifting snow and bodies to reach Jon and Oberyn, relief shining in her eyes. "Is it truly done?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Jon nodded, breath steaming in the cold air. We killed him, the Night King." He didn't say I or me, for it had been a desperate team effort. Oberyn's dagger, the combined assault, and the single opening that allowed Longclaw to land a fatal blow. Oberyn tried to stand, groaning at the pain in his wrist. "He nearly ended me," he muttered, wincing as the blood returned to his numbed hand. "But a Dornishman is not so easily killed." He attempted a grin but faltered, still rattled by how close he'd come to death. Daenerys crouched beside him, gently examining his wrist with a worried expression. "We'll get you a maester. You fought bravely." She looked around, heartbreak and pride mingling in her gaze. "So many dead, but we stopped them." Slowly, the rest of the living forces gathered. Sansa Stark appeared at the gates of Winterfell, a group of archers in tow, tears of relief on her face. She hurried to Jon, hugging him tightly, ignoring the blood and grime. Tormund Giantsbane and the wildlings cheered, though many of their comrades lay still on the field. Grey Worm and the Unsullied formed up, battered but victorious. Freedmen from Essos joined Northern Knights in raising a ragged cheer. Even the surviving knights from the Vale, who had arrived late to the fray, realized they had witnessed a moment that would shape the realm's future. As the sun rose higher, the swirling snowstorm dispersed, leaving a battlefield quiet except for the soft moans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. The White Walkers had vanished. The Whites lay dormant. Death had claimed a horrific toll, but the living had prevailed. A hush of awe settled upon the survivors as they understood the significance. The long night had been averted. The realm had survived a threat older than any feud or dynasty. In that moment, Daenerys Targaryen stood at the center of the battered armies, dragons coiling around the sky overhead. Jon Snow, Sansa Stark, Oberyn Martell, and the rest of the realm's defenders encircled her. Many knelt, either from exhaustion or from a sense of reverence. She did not bid them to stand. She simply placed a hand over her heart, as if acknowledging the cost of this victory and the unity that had forged it. No one spoke for a long while. The crows began to gather at the edges of the field, drawn by the scent of blood, but the living ignored them. The hush was the hush of a realm that realized it had come through its darkest hour by standing together. North and South, men and women, freedmen and highborn, Targaryen and Stark and Martell. Whatever future lay ahead, it would be shaped not by petty squabbles and vendettas, but by the knowledge that when the living were truly united, even the greatest of evils could be turned to dust. In the days and weeks that followed, the survivors buried their dead, aided the wounded, and offered prayers of thanksgiving to their various gods. At Winterfell's Great Hall, a council convened to plan the realm's next steps. Many believed that Daenerys, having delivered them from the White Walkers, was the rightful queen of a united Westeros, by action and by victory, not just by birthright or conquest. Jon Snow, though some still saw him as king in the north, publicly acknowledged Daenerys' claim, reminding his people that she had come to save them when no one else would. The northern lords, for their part, bowed to Daenerys willingly, grateful for her dragons and her armies. The last vestiges of Lannister influence had crumbled under the combined weight of the Targaryen-Dornish alliance. Tyrion Lannister, if he survived or remained absent in this telling, might reemerge in future days, but the House of the Lion no longer posed a threat to the realm. Oberyn Martell, his frostbitten wrist bound in bandages, received warm thanks from both Northerners and freedmen. Stories spread of how the Red Viper had nearly died confronting the Night King, only to help create the opening Jon Snow seized. The tale grew in the telling, sometimes exaggerating Oberyn's role, but he responded with a wry grin. "I was just a man with a broken spear, helping a fellow warrior land the fatal blow," he said. "But I'll take the praise if it means we can all sleep easier now." When Daenerys and Jon announced their intention to remain in the north for a time, to help rebuild and to honor those who had fallen, a new sense of camaraderie filled the battered land. There were still tensions, of course. Some lords from the south were eager to return home, to restore their holdings and see to their families. But there was no question that a new day had dawned in Westeros. The old wheel of vengeance and division had been shattered on the field outside Winterfell. As spring approached, heralded by the eventual retreat of winter's worst chill, people whispered that this time, the realm truly might have a chance for lasting peace. The freedmen from Essos, who had joined Daenerys' cause, found a place in the northern communities, forging ties with locals who once viewed them with suspicion. Dornish merchants established trade routes to the north, something unheard of for generations. The Vale, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, and the Reach slowly knit themselves into this new tapestry of unity. Dorne, under Prince Doran and Oberyn's guidance, took pride in having facilitated Daenerys' rise at a pivotal moment. And so it was that a single choice, Oberyn Martell's decision long ago to seek out Daenerys Targaryen in Meereen and hasten her invasion, had profoundly reshaped the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Instead of dying in the sands of the arena or on the blades of the mountain, Oberyn had lived to ensure a Targaryen restoration. Instead of a realm torn apart by multiple pretenders, Westeros had found itself more swiftly united under a queen who fought not for personal glory but to protect the living. The cost in blood had been high, yet the realm had weathered the storm. Years later, in a time of renewed harvests and rebuilding, travelers passing through Winterfell would pause at a simple stone monument raised in memory of those who fell in the battle for the dawn. They would see names carved there, Northerners and Southerners, freedmen and wildlings, men of many backgrounds who had stood as one. Among the tales recounted by local storytellers, one would hear of how the Red Viper of Dorne and the Bastard of Winterfell fought side by side at the end, how dragons lit the skies with fire, how an exiled queen claimed her throne just in time to save a world teetering on the brink of eternal night. And if those travelers ventured still farther south, to the scorching deserts of Dorne, they might find a different kind of monument in Sunspear. A statue bearing the likeness of Oberyn Martell, spear in hand, crafted to celebrate the prince who had catalyzed the Targaryen queen's triumphant return. Standing beneath the blazing Dornish sun, that statue reminded the realm that vengeance, once tempered by hope, could serve a purpose greater than hatred alone. For in that statue's shadow, children would play, oblivious to the wars and terrors of the past, growing up in a realm bound together not by fear, but by shared struggle and the dream of a brighter tomorrow. Such was the legacy of the partnership between the Viper and the Dragon Queen. It did not end with the slaying of Lannisters or the capturing of a throne. It continued in the forging of alliances, the battle against a darkness older than any mortal feud, and the rebirth of a realm taught that sometimes the only way to overcome the old cycle was to break it altogether. And if the wind carried the faint roar of dragons or the whisper of a spear's sharp tip, it was a reminder that the Seven Kingdoms had indeed lived through the direst times, emerging at last into a sunrise that warmed even the coldest corners of the north.